Hey guys, today we begin with lost stones, buried cities, and silent scrolls suddenly speaking again. Tonight we'll uncover the surprising finds that flipped our history books upside down, from a single slab that unlocked Egypt's voice to laser beams revealing hidden Maya highways. But before you get comfortable, please make sure to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely appreciate the work I do here. And please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, put your phone or television remote out of reach, and let's move into tonight's journey together. In the summer of 1799, as Napoleon's ambitious expedition carved its way through Egypt's ancient heart, a French officer named Pierre-François Bouchard knelt beside a pile of rubble near the town of Rosetta. The Nile Delta stretched endlessly around him, its fertile mud hiding secrets that had slumbered for millennia. What Bouchard pulled from that heap of stone would unlock a door that had been sealed since the last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 AD. The stone itself was unremarkable at first glance here, slab of dark basalt, cracked and weathered, about the size of a modern dining table. But as Bouchard brushed away centuries of accumulated dirt, three distinct scripts emerged from the darkness. Greek characters danced along the bottom, familiar and readable. Above them, a middle band of strange cursive symbols seemed to flow like water across the stone. And at the top, the mysterious hieroglyphs, those sacred carvings that had adorned temple walls and tomb chambers throughout Egypt's golden ages, stared back at him with their eternal silence. The stone was quickly recognized as something extraordinary. Here was the same text written in three different scripts: Ancient Greek, Demotic Egyptian, and Hieroglyphic Egyptian. It was as if the ancients had left behind a cosmic cipher, a key that might finally unlock the meaning of those enigmatic bird-headed gods and sacred eyes that had puzzled scholars for centuries. Word of the discovery rippled through the scholarly world like wildfire. The stone made its way to London after the British defeated Napoleon's forces, where it was housed in the British Museum. But the real race was just beginning, a candle-lit marathon of intellectual pursuit that would consume the brightest minds of Europe for over 2 decades. Thomas Young, a British polymath, was among the first to make meaningful progress. Working by lamplight in his London study, he correctly identified that the oval shapes in the hieroglyphic text called cartouche contained royal names. He managed to decode the name of Ptolemy, matching it to the Greek text below. It was a breakthrough, but Young believed hieroglyphs were primarily symbolic, each character representing an entire concept or idea. Meanwhile, in France, a young man named Jean-François Champollion was developing a different theory entirely. Born in the foothills of the French Alps, Champollion had shown an uncanny gift for languages from childhood. By age 16, he could read Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, and Coptic, the latter being the direct descendant of ancient Egyptian, preserved in Christian communities. This knowledge of Coptic would prove to be his secret weapon. Champollion's approach was methodical and obsessive. He covered the walls of his study with hieroglyphic symbols, creating elaborate charts and cross-references. He compared the Rosetta Stone with other Egyptian texts, slowly building a database of recurring patterns. Unlike Young, Champollion suspected that hieroglyphs functioned more like an alphabet, with individual symbols representing sounds rather than entire concepts. The breakthrough came on September 14, 1822. Champollion was examining cartouches from the temple of Abu Simbel when he encountered two symbols that would change everything: a sun disk and a repeated symbol that looked like the letter S. He knew from Coptic that Ra meant sun, and the S sound could be represented by the repeated symbol. If this cartouche spelled Ra, S, SR, it could be the name Ramesses the Great Pharaoh whose monuments dotted Egypt. His hands trembling with excitement, Champollion applied this phonetic approach to another cartouche, an ibis bird, which he knew represented the god Thoth, followed by similar symbols. Thoth? S could be Thutmose, another famous pharaoh. The realization hit him like lightning. Hieroglyphs were not purely symbolic. They were a complex system that combined phonetic, syllabic, and ideographic elements. Champollion rushed to his brother's office, bursting through the door with the words, "Je tiens l'affaire. I've got it." He then collapsed from exhaustion, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his discovery. For 5 days he lay in bed, his mind processing the implications of what he had unlocked. When Champollion recovered, he began the painstaking work of deciphering Egypt's written legacy. Suddenly, temple walls began to speak, royal chronicles revealed their secrets, religious texts shared their sacred mysteries. The ancient Egyptians, silent for over 14 centuries, began to tell their own stories again. The impact was immediate and profound. Everything historians thought they knew about ancient Egypt had to be reconsidered. Dates were corrected, dynasties were reordered, and the sophisticated nature of Egyptian civilization became clear. The Rosetta Stone had not just provided a translation key, it had resurrected an entire culture's voice. Today, that black basalt slab sits in the British Museum, still drawing crowds who come to witness the artifact that broke open the ancient world. 3 scripts on a single stony decree about tax exemptions for priests, mundane in content but revolutionary in consequence. Sometimes history's greatest revelations hide in the most ordinary places, waiting for the right mind to recognize their extraordinary potential. The stone reminds us that the past is never truly lost, only temporarily silenced, waiting for someone curious enough to listen to its whispers between the scripts. On the morning of August 24th, 79 AD, the citizens of Pompeii woke to what seemed like an ordinary day. Merchants opened their shops along the Via dell'Abbondanza, children played in the streets, and the wealthy reclined in their garden courtyards, unaware that Mount Vesuvius was about to transform their bustling Roman city into history's most perfectly preserved time capsule. The mountain had been rumbling for days, but earthquakes were common in the region. What the Pompeians couldn't have known was that beneath their feet, magma had been building pressure for over 1,700 years. When Vesuvius finally erupted that fateful morning, it didn't simply destroy 2 cities, it froze them in time with such precision that nearly 2 millennia later, we can still see the bread in the ovens and read the graffiti on the walls. The rediscovery of Pompeii began not with archaeologists, but with well diggers. In 1599, workmen digging a tunnel to divert the river, Sarno stumbled upon ancient walls covered in paintings. They had no idea they had found Pompeii, that revelation would wait another century and a half. It wasn't until 1748 that systematic excavation began under the Spanish engineer Roque Joaquín de Alcubierre, though his methods were more akin to treasure hunting than archaeological science. What emerged from the volcanic ash was breathtaking in its intimacy. Unlike other ancient sites where only foundations and fragments remain, Pompeii presented entire buildings with their roofs intact, frescoes as vibrant as the day they were painted, and household objects still arranged as their owners had left them. In the House of the Vetii, erotic frescoes adorned the walls with a frankness that shocked Victorian-era excavators. In the Villa of the Papyri at nearby Herculaneum, an entire library of scrolls waited to be unrolled, their ancient philosophy preserved in carbonized form. The most haunting discoveries were the human remains. When excavators found hollow spaces in the hardened ash, Italian archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli had a revolutionary idea. In 1863, he began pouring plaster into these voids, creating perfect casts of Pompeii's final moments. The results were devastating in their emotional power, families huddled together, a dog writhing on its chain, a pregnant woman curled protectively around her unborn child, gladiators still wearing their armor in their barracks. These plaster casts revealed the eruption's timeline with horrifying clarity. The first phase buried the city in lightweight pumice stone, allowing many residents to flee. But those who stayed, or tried to ride out the disaster, faced a second, deadlier phase. Pyroclastic superheated gas and ash, moving at hurricane speed, swept down the mountain at temperatures exceeding 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Death was instantaneous, preserving final gestures and expressions with tragic precision. Each excavated building rewrote textbooks about Roman daily life. The Stabian baths revealed sophisticated engineering, with underground furnaces heating air that circulated through hollow walls and floors. The amphitheatre, one of the oldest stone amphitheatres in the Roman world, still bore graffiti from spectators. Celadus, the Thracian gladiator, is the delight of all the girls, and Marcus loves spendusa, carved into the stone benches. The bakeries of Pompeii preserve not just ovens and grinding stones, but loaves of bread still sitting on shelves, their surfaces marked with the baker's stamp. Wine bars called thermopolia displayed their menus on marble counters, complete with embedded jars for serving different varieties of wine. Political campaign slogans painted on walls revealed a surprisingly democratic society, where even women and slaves publicly endorsed candidates. Perhaps most remarkably, Pompeii's brothels preserved intimate details of Roman sexuality that no literary source had recorded. The Lupanar, the city's largest brothel, contained explicit frescoes above each doorway, to a visual menu for clients who might not share a common language with the prostitutes, many of whom were slaves from across the empire. The houses themselves told stories of social stratification and daily routines. Wealthy homes like the House of the Faun showcased elaborate mosaics depicting Alexander the Great's battles, while modest dwellings revealed how ordinary Romans lived, worked, and died. Gardens preserved the root systems of ancient plants, allowing botanists to recreate Roman landscaping with exact plant species. Herculaneum, Pompeii's smaller neighbor, offered different insights. Buried under deeper volcanic flow, it preserved organic materials that Pompeii's ash had destroyed. Wooden furniture, papyrus scrolls, and even food remained intact. In one villa, excavators found a meal still sitting on the table: bread, eggs, fish, and wine, abandoned mid-bite when the mountain exploded. Modern technology continues to reveal Pompeii's secrets. Ground-penetrating radar maps unexcavated areas without disturbing them. Digital scanners create virtual reconstructions of damaged frescoes. DNA analysis of human remains reveals migration patterns across the Roman Empire. CT scans of plaster casts show jewelry hidden beneath clothing and the final contents of stomachs. Today, walking through Pompeii's streets feels like time travel. Chariot ruts still mark the stone roads. Ancient fast food restaurants display their earthenware jars. Public fountains bear the wear marks of countless hands. The city serves as humanity's most visceral reminder that civilizations, no matter how sophisticated, remain vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Vesuvius still looms over the modern city of Naples, still active, still watched by volcanologists who understand what the Romans did not. The mountain that created history's greatest archaeological treasure remains capable of writing new chapters in catastrophe. In Pompeii's frozen streets, past and future converge in stone and ash, whispering their eternal warnings about the fragility of human ambition in the face of natural power. On September 12, 1940, as World War II raged across Europe, 4 French teenagers and their dog Robot were exploring the forests near Montignac in the Dordogne region. Marcel Ravadat, Jacques Marsal, Georges Agnel, and Simon Coenkes had heard rumors of a secret tunnel that might lead to treasure. Instead, when they squeezed through a hole left by an uprooted tree, they discovered something far more valuable than Golda Cathedral of prehistoric art that would revolutionize our understanding of human consciousness and creativity. The boys' carbide lamps flickered across walls that seemed to breathe with life. Massive, auroch-sentient wild cat galloped across the limestone ceiling in flowing lines of ochre and charcoal. Horses pranced and reared, their manes flowing in eternal motion. Deer bounded across rocky surfaces as if frozen mid-leap. The young explorers had stumbled into what would become known as the Sistine Chapel of Prehistoric Art, a gallery painted by Cro-Magnon artists approximately 0 years ago. When the boys returned with their schoolmaster, Léon Laval, the true magnitude of their discovery became clear. The cave system extended over 200 meters underground, divided into several chambers, each decorated with hundreds of animal figures. The main hall, now called the Hall of Bulls, contained the largest prehistoric paintings ever, discovered some aurochs stretched over 5 meters long, painted with a sophistication that challenged every assumption about Stone Age intelligence. The French government quickly classified Lascaux, and prehistoric art expert Abbé Henri Bru began the first systematic study. What Bru documented defied logic. These weren't crude stick figures or simple handprints. These were masterworks created by artists who understood perspective, shading, and the use of natural rock contours to create three-dimensional effects. A horse's head emerging from a limestone bulge seemed to step from the wall. Bulls painted around natural cracks appeared to move as lamplight flickered across their forms. The technical mastery was equally astounding. The artists had created sophisticated pigments by mixing iron oxides for reds and yellows, manganese dioxide for blacks, and charcoal for deep shadows. They had blown pigment through hollow bones to create spray paint effects, used twisted hair as brushes, and employed fingers to smudge and blend colors. Some paintings showed evidence of scaffolding, suggesting organized group efforts rather than individual expression. Carbon dating revealed the cave's timeline. The paintings weren't created in a single period, but across roughly 20 years, with different artistic traditions building upon earlier work. Some images were painted over older ones, creating palimpsests of prehistoric expression. The cave had been sealed by a rockfall around 15,000 years ago, preserving the paintings in pristine condition until the teenager's accidental discovery. Perhaps most remarkably, Lascaux challenged assumptions about prehistoric spirituality and intellectual development. This wasn't just decoration, it was storytelling, mythology, and possibly astronomy. The famous Birdman scene in The Shaft of the Dead Man depicts what might be humanity's oldest narrative art. A human figure with a bird-like head lying before a wounded bison, while a bird perched on a stick watches nearby. Scholars debate whether it represents a shaman's vision quest, a hunting accident, or humanity's first mythological tale. Some researchers propose astronomical interpretations. The arrangement of animal figures might represent constellation maps, with the Pleiades cluster corresponding to a group of painted dots above a massive bull. If true, Lascaux would represent humanity's oldest star chart, proving that Paleolithic people were sophisticated observers of celestial movements. The painting techniques revealed planning and foresight that rewrote timelines of human cognitive development. Artists had prepared their canvases by scraping cave walls smooth, then sketching outlines before applying pigments. They used the cave's natural acoustics, concentrating paintings in areas with the best sound resonance, suggesting the images accompanied ritual singing or storytelling. The caves might have been prehistoric theaters as much as art galleries. Unfortunately, Lascaux's discovery coincided with humanity's growing ability to destroy what it sought to preserve. When the cave opened to tourists in 1948, carbon dioxide from visitors' breath began degrading the paintings. Green algae, dubbed the green sickness, spread across surfaces that had remained pristine for millennia. By 1963, French authorities made the heartbreaking decision to close Lascaux to the public forever. The closure sparked innovation in archaeological preservation. Lascaux II, an exact replica built nearby, allowed visitors to experience the cave's wonder without threatening the originals. Advanced laser scanning has created digital models accurate to within millimeters. These technologies pioneered methods now used to preserve archaeological sites worldwide. Modern analysis continues, revealing Lascaux's secrets. Microscopic examination shows that different artists had distinctive techniques, some left-handed, others right-handed, some preferring broad strokes, others fine detail work. DNA analysis of hair fibers trapped in dried pigments might eventually identify the artists themselves, connecting us directly to hands that worked by torchlight in humanity's dawn. The cave's impact on archaeology was immediate and profound. Lascaux proved that artistic sophistication wasn't a recent human development, but had roots stretching back tens of thousands of years. The people who painted these walls possessed symbolic thinking, aesthetic sensibility, and cultural continuity across generations. They weren't savage hunters struggling for survival, they were humans recognizing beauty, creating meaning, and leaving messages for the future. Today, Lascaux remains sealed, its paintings monitored by sensors that track temperature, humidity, and air quality. Scientists can observe the ancient art through cameras, but cannot touch or directly experience the sacred space that four curious teenagers discovered in humanity's darkest hour. Perhaps that's fitting. Some treasures are too precious for direct human contact, too fragile for anything but remote reverence. In those limestone chambers, our ancestors proved that the human spirit has always reached beyond mere survival toward transcendence, beauty, and connection across time. Their painted cathedral stands as humanity's oldest prayer, their brushstrokes our earliest signature, their vision our deepest inheritance from the starry vaults of prehistory. In the early spring of 1900, sponge divers working the deep waters off the Greek island of Antikythera were forced by rough seas to seek shelter near a small rocky outcrop. Captain Demetrius Kondos decided to send his divers down to explore the sea floor, hoping they might find sponges to make their detour profitable. Instead, diver Elias Stadiatis surfaced with tales of horror heap of rotting corpses littering the ocean bottom, their limbs reaching toward the surface in silent supplication. When Kondos dove to investigate, he discovered not bodies but bronze and marble statues, their green patina and graceful poses marking them as treasures from antiquity. The divers had stumbled upon one of the richest shipwrecks ever discovered, a Roman cargo vessel that had sunk sometime in the 1st century BC while carrying plundered Greek artworks to Rome. Among the amphorae, coins, and sculptures lay a corroded lump of bronze that would prove more revolutionary than all the golden treasures combined. The bronze mechanism was barely noticed during the initial salvage operations. It appeared to be nothing more than a heavily corroded rock, its surface eaten away by 2 millennia of salt water. The archaeological team carefully transported it to the National Archeological Museum in Athens, where it sat largely ignored while scholars focused on the more obviously valuable marble statues and golden jewelry recovered from the wreck. It wasn't until 1902 that archaeologist Valerios Stais noticed something unusual about the corroded mass. Examining it more closely, he glimpsed the outline of a gear wheel embedded in the bronze. This was impossible. Complex gear mechanisms weren't supposed to exist in the ancient world. The consensus among historians was that such sophisticated mechanical engineering didn't develop until medieval Islamic scientists and later European clockmakers perfected gear trains over 1,000 years later. Stais's colleagues initially dismissed his observations. The gears must be from a much later period, perhaps a medieval astrolabe that had somehow become mixed with the ancient artifacts. But as more pieces of the device were carefully separated and examined, an undeniable truth emerged. This was a complex mechanical computer created by Greek artisans over 2,000 years ago that had been lost to the bottom of the Mediterranean before Christ was born. The mechanism's true complexity only became apparent through decades of painstaking research. In the 1950s, British science historian Derek J. de Solar-Price began the first serious study of the device, using X-rays to peer through the corrosion and map the internal gear structure. What he discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about ancient Greek technological capabilities. The device contained at least 37 bronze gears, arranged in a sophisticated mechanical computer designed to calculate and predict the movements of the sun, moon, and planets. Price's X-ray images revealed inscriptions in ancient Greek covering the device's surfaces and instruction manual, explaining how to operate humanity's first analog computer. The text described how to use the mechanism to predict eclipses, track the 4-year cycle of Olympic Games, and follow the wandering paths of Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn across the night sky. This was celestial mechanics made manifest in bronze, a machine that could compress the vast complexity of cosmic motion into the turn of a hand crank. The sophistication of the gear ratios astounded mechanical engineers. To accurately model the moon's elliptical orbit, the ancient craftsmen had created an epicyclic gear system, a complex arrangement where smaller gears rotate around the edges of larger ones, producing the variable speed necessary to match the moon's actual motion across the sky. This level of mechanical sophistication wouldn't appear again in European clockwork until the 14th century. Modern reconstructions using advanced imaging technology have revealed even more startling details. High-resolution CT scans performed in the 2000s showed that the device originally contained far more gears than initially suspected, possibly over 100 individual components working in precise coordination. The mechanism could predict the positions of celestial bodies decades into the future, calculate the dates of solar and lunar eclipses, and even account for the slight irregularities in lunar motion, that weren't mathematically described until Johannes Kepler's work in the 17th century. The cultural implications were equally profound. The Antikythera mechanism proved that ancient Greeks possessed not just theoretical knowledge of astronomy and mathematics, but the practical engineering skills to build mechanical computers. This suggested a level of technological development that ancient texts had only hinted at. References in classical literature to elaborate mechanical devices like the golden servants created by the god Hephaestus or the automated door-opening systems in Alexandria's temples suddenly seemed less like mythology and more like historical records of lost technology. The device also revealed the interconnection between Greek science and daily life. The mechanism wasn't just an academic exercise, but a practical tool for navigation, agriculture, and religious observances. Ancient Greeks used it to plan festivals, according to lunar calendars, time agricultural activities to celestial cycles, and navigate by predicting the positions of stars and planets. The cosmos wasn't abstract mathematics but lived experience, mechanical precision translating divine order into human understanding. Perhaps most remarkably, the Antikythera mechanism suggests that ancient technology developed along different paths than modern assumptions predicted. Rather than a steady progression from simple to complex, ancient craftsmen achieved mechanical sophistication that was then lost for over a millennium. The device represents a technological road not taken, a branch of human development that was severed by historical circumstances and only recently rediscovered in the depths of the Mediterranean. Recent archaeological discoveries have hinted that the Antikythera device might not have been unique. References in ancient texts to similar mechanisms, combined with fragments of gear wheels found at other sites, suggest that mechanical computers might have been more common in the Hellenistic world than previously imagined. The technology to create such devices existed, along with the astronomical knowledge necessary to design them and the cultural demand to justify their construction. Today, the corroded fragments of the Antikythera mechanism rest in climate-controlled cases in Athens, their bronze surfaces bearing witness to humanity's earliest attempt to capture the universe in clockwork. The device reminds us that our ancestors were not primitive peoples struggling with basic survival, but sophisticated engineers capable of translating abstract mathematical concepts into precise mechanical reality. In its corroded gears lies proof that the human drive to understand and predict the cosmos stretches back over 2 millennia, encoded in bronze and lost to tide, waiting for curious divers to resurrect its bronze cosmos from the depths of time. In the winter of 1946, a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Hidib was searching for a lost goat among the limestone cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea. The barren landscape of Qumran stretched endlessly around him, a wilderness so harsh that even the ancient Romans had called it the ends of the earth. When Muhammad threw a stone into a cave opening, hoping to flush out his missing animal, he heard not the bleat of a goat, but the sharp crack of pottery breaking. Curious and perhaps hoping for treasure, he squeezed through the narrow entrance and discovered clay jars containing scrolls wrapped in linen manuscripts that would revolutionize biblical scholarship and rewrite the history of Judaism and early Christianity. The scrolls that Muhammad found that day were unlike anything seen in nearly 2,000 years. Written on parchment and papyrus in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, they represented the library of a Jewish sectarian community that had lived in the Qumran wilderness during the final centuries before Christ's birth. Some scrolls contained the earliest known copies of biblical texts, preserving books of the Hebrew Bible 1,000 years older than any previously discovered manuscript. Others revealed the beliefs and practices of a previously unknown Jewish sect, their apocalyptic worldview and strict religious discipline offering unprecedented insights into the diverse spiritual landscape of ancient Palestine. Word of the discovery filtered slowly through the antiquities markets of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The Bedouin who had found the scrolls sold them to antiquities dealers, who in turn approached scholars and collectors. The Archbishop of the Syrian Orthodox Monastery of St. Mark, Mar Athanasius Yeshu Samuel, purchased 4 scrolls for what would prove to be the bargain of the millennium. Meanwhile, Professor Eliezer Sukenik of Hebrew University acquired 3 others, recognizing immediately that these were ancient Hebrew manuscripts of extraordinary significance. The political chaos of 1,948 Palestine complicated efforts to study and preserve the scrolls. As the British Mandate ended and the Arab-Israeli War began, scholars found themselves racing against time to examine manuscripts that were literally crumbling in their hands. The scrolls that Archbishop Samuel had purchased were even taken to the United States, where they were eventually sold through a classified advertisement in the Wall Street Journal to Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin for $250,000. Meanwhile, Bedouin continued discovering additional caves in the Qumran region. Between 1,947 and 1,956, 11 caves yielded manuscript fragments, with Cave 4 alone producing over 15 pieces, representing more than 500 different texts. The recovery operation became increasingly systematic as archaeologists realized the magnitude of the find. Each fragment, no matter how small, potentially contained unique textual variants or previously unknown writings from the crucial period when Judaism was evolving into its rabbinic form and Christianity was emerging as a distinct religion. The most famous of the initial discoveries was the Isaiah scroll, a complete copy of the biblical book that predated any previously known Hebrew Bible manuscript by over a millennium. When scholars compared this ancient text with modern Hebrew Bibles, they were astounded by the accuracy of textual transmission across centuries. The scroll validated the reliability of biblical copying traditions while also revealing fascinating variant readings that shed new light on the text development. Even more revolutionary were the sectarian documents that revealed the beliefs and practices of the Qumran community. The community rule described a highly organized religious society with strict admission procedures, communal property ownership, and elaborate purity regulations. The War Scroll outlined an apocalyptic battle between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness that would herald the end times. The Damascus document revealed connections between the Qumran sect and other Jewish groups scattered throughout the ancient world. Perhaps most intriguingly, the scrolls preserved numerous texts that had been lost for nearly 2,000 years. The Temple Scroll described an idealized temple larger and more elaborate than the one that stood in Jerusalem. The Copper Scroll, inscribed on copper sheets rather than parchment, listed the locations of buried treasure throughout Palestine, though whether this represented real or symbolic wealth remains debated. Previously unknown psalms, prayers, and wisdom literature expanded the known corpus of ancient Jewish religious writing. The scrolls also illuminated the complex religious landscape of first-century Palestine. Rather than the simple division between mainstream Judaism and emerging Christianity that traditional scholarship had assumed, the manuscripts revealed a diverse spectrum of Jewish sects, each with distinct beliefs about law, prophecy, and messianic expectations. The Qumran community appears to have been one of several groups awaiting divine intervention to restore Israel's religious and political independence. Controversies surrounding the scrolls began almost immediately and continue today. Initial scholarly teams were small and access was restricted, leading to decades of delays in publication and accusations of academic monopolization. Theories about the identity of the Qumran sect ranged from Essenes to early Christians to rebels against Roman rule. Some scholars argued that the scrolls contained references to Jesus or John the Baptist, while others maintained that the texts predated Christianity entirely. The most contentious debates centered on the scrolls' implications for understanding Christian origins. Did the Qumran community's beliefs about a suffering Messiah, baptismal practices, and communal meals influence early Christianity? Or did similarities between the scrolls and New Testament texts reflect common Jewish traditions rather than direct connections? These questions touched on fundamental issues of religious identity and historical development that extended far beyond academic curiosity. Modern technology has revolutionized scroll scholarship in recent decades. High-resolution digital imaging has made fragments visible that were previously impossible to read. Computer algorithms can now suggest reconstructions of damaged texts and identify minute textual variants. DNA analysis of parchment fragments has helped determine which pieces originated from the same animal hide, allowing scholars to reconstruct scroll contents more accurately. The preservation challenges have been immense. Many scrolls survive 2 millennia in the desert, only to begin deteriorating rapidly once exposed to modern atmospheric conditions. Fragments turned to dust in scholars' hands. Ink faded when exposed to light. The Israel Antiquities Authority has invested millions of dollars in climate-controlled storage facilities and conservation techniques to preserve the remaining fragments for future generations. Today, nearly all the Dead Sea Scrolls have been published and are available for scholarly study worldwide through digital databases and high-resolution photographs. The manuscripts continue yielding new insights as scholars develop better techniques for reading damaged texts, and as archaeological work in the Qumran region reveals additional context for understanding the community that preserved these ancient writings. The scrolls remain testimony to the power of human devotion to preserve sacred texts despite persecution, war, and exile. The Qumran community's decision to hide their library in desert caves proved remarkably prescient. Their wilderness refuge protected humanity's oldest biblical manuscripts through 2 millennia of political upheaval, religious transformation, and cultural change. In their silent scrolls, voices from antiquity continue speaking across the centuries, reminding us that the search for divine truth has always required both scholarly dedication and the simple faith of shepherds willing to explore dark caves in search of what has been lost. Picture this. It's March 1974, and you're a farmer in Xi'an province, China. The drought has been merciless, your crops are withering, and you desperately need water. So you grab your shovel and start digging a well. The earth gives way easily at first, typical Loess soil, nothing unusual. But then your blade strikes something hard, not a rock. Something smooth, curved, almost deliberate. You brush away the dirt, and staring back at you is a face, a human face, but wrong somehow, too perfect, too still, made of clay, but with eyes that seem to hold secrets from 2 millennia past. You've just stumbled upon what historians would later call the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the terracotta army of Emperor Qin Shi Huang. But let's rewind 22 centuries to understand what you've really found. The year is 259 BCE. And a boy named Ying Zheng is born into the warring chaos of ancient China. 7 kingdoms tear at each other's throats, each claiming legitimacy, each dreaming of unification. Young Zheng has bigger dreams than most. By age 13, he's ruling the state of Qin. By 25, he's conquered every rival kingdom and declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. This wasn't just political theater. Qin Shi Huang genuinely believed he was transforming the cosmic order itself. He standardized currency, writing systems, even the width of cart axles so every wheel would fit every rut across his vast empire. But beneath this rational administrative genius lurked a profound paranoia about death. The emperor who had unified the living world became obsessed with controlling the afterlife too. Ancient Chinese cosmology taught that death was merely a transition, not an ending. The emperor would need protection, servants, and armies in the spirit realm just as he had in life. But here's where Qin's story takes a fascinating turn. Earlier dynasties had practiced human sacrifice, burying living servants with dead rulers. Qin, for all his reputation as a tyrant, apparently found this wasteful. Why kill your skilled artisans when you could employ them to create something unprecedented? Enter the workshops of Li County, where thousands of craftsmen began the most ambitious mortuary project in human history. These weren't just potters throwing clay on wheels. Archaeological evidence reveals an industrial-scale operation that would make Henry Ford proud. Different workshops specialized in different body parts, heads, torsos, arms, legs, with assembly lines that could produce warriors by the thousands while maintaining individual variation. Each terracotta soldier stands about 6 feet tall, weighs roughly 400 pounds, and possesses a unique face. Not metaphorically unique or literally unique. Archaeologists have catalogued over 0 figures so far, and no 2 faces are identical. Some scholars believe the craftsmen used living soldiers as models, creating a clay census of Qin's actual army. Others suggest the artisans drew from memory banks of facial features, mixing and matching with algorithmic precision that predates computers by 2 millennia. The construction process reveals even more sophistication. Each figure was built from the ground up, literally. Solid clay feet provided stability, while hollow torsos reduced weight without sacrificing strength. Arms were attached using clay strips that functioned like ancient rivets. Most remarkably, the entire army was originally painted in vibrant colors: reds, greens, purples, blacks that began flaking away the moment archaeologists exposed them to air and light. But the soldiers were just the beginning. Excavations revealed bronze chariots drawn by terracotta horses so anatomically precise that veterinarians used them to study ancient breeding techniques. Acrobats frozen mid-performance, musicians clutching instruments, court officials bearing scrolls, even a team of bronze waterfowl cranes and swans that modern engineers admit they couldn't replicate without computer-aided design. The sheer logistics boggle the mind. Conservative estimates suggest the project required 700 workers over nearly 4 decades. Kilns operated around the clock, consuming entire forests for fuel. Clay had to be sourced, refined, and transported. Bronze weapons, real ones, sharp enough to cut silk even today, were forged by master metallurgists. The whole operation resembled a city dedicated to death, populated by craftsmen who understood they were creating something that would outlast empires. Recent excavations continue revealing the scope of Qin's vision. Ground-penetrating radar has mapped additional chambers containing terracotta civil officials, suggesting the emperor planned to govern the afterlife with the same bureaucratic precision he'd applied to China. Other areas appear to contain recreations of his palace, complete with rivers of mercury flowing beneath bronze heavens, studded with pearls representing stars. When that farmer's shovel broke through in 1974, it didn't just uncover statues. It revealed a worldview where death was simply another administrative challenge, where imperial power extended beyond mortality, and where human creativity could preserve individual faces for thousands of years. The terracotta army stands as perhaps history's most ambitious answer to a universal human question: what happens when we die? Qin Shi Huang's reply was characteristically grandiose: "We take everything with us, and we take it in style." Let's travel to southeastern Turkey, to a hilltop called Göbekli Tepe, literally Potbelly Hill, where everything we thought we knew about human civilization crumbles like ancient limestone. It's 1963, and University of Chicago archaeologists are conducting a regional survey. They notice scattered worked stones on this particular hill, catalog them as probable medieval cemetery remains, and move on. For 30 years, Göbekli Tepe sleeps under assumptions and accumulated earth. Then Klaus Schmidt arrives in 1994, drawn by those earlier notes and blessed with fresh eyes. What the Chicago team dismissed as grave markers, Schmidt recognizes as something far more extraordinary: the tops of massive stone pillars, weathered but unmistakably carved, jutting from soil like fingers, reaching from humanity's deepest past. The first excavation season reveals pillars standing 15 feet tall, weighing up to 20 tons each, arranged in precise circles. But it's the carvings that stop Schmidt's breath: prowling lions, coiled serpents, soaring birds of prey, wild boars with bristling fury, bulls charging across stone surfaces, and foxes gunning, alert foxes that seem almost ready to leap from the limestone. Here's what makes your spine tingle. Radiocarbon dating places these circles at roughly 9,500 BCE. That's 500 years ago, friends. To put this in perspective, Göbekli Tepe was already ancient when the first stones were laid at Stonehenge. It predates agriculture, permanent settlements, even pottery. These massive temple complexes were carved and erected by people we've always assumed were simple hunter-gatherers, supposedly too busy surviving to create monumental architecture. But survival, it turns out, is more complicated than we imagined. The Göbekli builders lived during the Younger Dryasa geological hiccup, when glacial conditions returned for over 1,000 years, disrupting the steady warming that followed the last ice age. Temperatures plummeted. Rainfall shifted. The abundant megafauna that had sustained human groups for millennia began disappearing. Mammoths, giant elk, cave bear saws sliding toward extinction. In such times, you might expect humans to scatter, to focus entirely on finding food and shelter. Instead, at Göbekli Tepe, They gathered in unprecedented numbers to move mountains of stone. Literally, archaeological evidence suggests groups from hundreds of miles away converged on this hilltop, bringing tools, knowledge, and probably food to support the massive construction project. Consider the logistics. Each T-shaped pillar had to be quarried from limestone bedrock using stone tools, then somehow transported uphill and positioned with geometric precision. No metal tools, no wheels. No domesticated animals for heavy lifting. Just human ingenuity, cooperation, and an almost incomprehensible commitment to whatever this place represented. The animal carvings offer tantalizing clues about that purpose. These aren't random decorative choices, they're a carefully curated bestiary of Pleistocene predators and prey. Lions, leopards, bears, aurochs, wild boar, gazelles, onagers, birds of prey. Notice what's missing. Domesticated animals. No sheep, no goats, no cattle, no dogs. This is still the wild world, where humans remain just another species in a complex ecological web. Some pillars feature anthropomorphic element stone arms, hands, even belts and loincloths, suggesting they might represent stylized human figures. Giant stone ancestors perhaps, or gods taking human form. The T-shaped design itself might symbolize human torsos, with the horizontal bar representing shoulders and arms. If so, then each circle contains a gathering of stone beings, frozen in eternal council. Recent excavations have revealed at least 20 stone circles scattered across the hilltop, though only a fraction have been fully uncovered. Ground-penetrating radar suggests dozens more weight beneath the soil. Each circle appears slightly different, varying numbers of pillars, different animal themes, distinct architectural details. It's as if different groups or generations left their own signatures in stone. But here's where Göbekli Tepe becomes even more mysterious. Around 8000 BCE, at the very moment when agriculture was taking root across the Fertile Crescent, the builders deliberately buried their masterpiece. Not abandoned buried. They hauled thousands of tons of earth and rubble up the hill, carefully covering every pillar, every carved animal, every stone circle. It was meticulous, intentional, almost ritualistic. Why would they bury their sacred site just as civilization was dawning? Some archaeologists suggest Göbekli Tepe was a victim of its own success. Perhaps the massive gatherings required to maintain the site began straining local resources. As people developed agriculture and settled into permanent villages, the old ways of seasonal pilgrimage became impractical. Maybe burying the site was their way of honoring its importance while moving toward a new chapter of human existence. Others propose a more radical theory, that Göbekli Tepe actually catalyzed the agricultural revolution. The need to feed periodic gatherings of hundreds or thousands of people might have pressured local groups to begin deliberately cultivating wild grains and legumes. Archaeological botanists have indeed found some of the world's earliest evidence for wheat cultivation in the immediate vicinity of Göbekli Tepe. This flips our traditional narrative on its head. Instead of agriculture leading to civilization, maybe the drive to create sacred spacesto gather, to worship, to carve meaning into stone came first. Maybe the need to support such gatherings drove the agricultural innovations that would reshape human society. The implications ripple outward through everything we thought we knew about prehistoric life. These weren't crude hunter-gatherers stumbling towards civilization. They were sophisticated people with complex spiritual beliefs, advanced engineering skills, and the organizational capacity to coordinate massive construction projects across vast distances and time spans. At Göbekli Tepe, stone animals prowl through eternity, carrying messages we're still learning to read. They speak of a world where humans first realized they could impose their will on stone, where temporary gatherings became permanent monuments, where the boundary between the sacred and mundane was carved in limestone that still bears the chisel marks of humanity's greatest awakening. November 26, 1922, the Valley of the Kings bakes under the Egyptian sun, and Howard Carter peers through a hole he's just chiseled in an ancient doorway. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, asks impatiently, "Can you see anything?" Carter's reply becomes archaeology's most famous understatement. Yes, wonderful things. But let's rewind 3 millennia to understand what Carter saw shimmering in his lamplight. The year is approximately 1323 BCE, and Egypt mourns the death of its boy king, Tutankhamun. He's barely 19, has ruled for only 9 years, and dies under circumstances that still puzzle forensic pathologists. His reign was brief, his achievements modest, his name destined for obscurity. In the grand pantheon of pharaohs, Tutankhamun should have been a footnote. Instead, he became immortal not through conquest or monument building, but through the simple accident of remaining hidden. The young pharaoh's death triggered a burial process that was part religious ceremony, part industrial undertaking. 70 days of mummification began immediately. The brain was removed through the nose with bronze hooks, the internal organs extracted and preserved in canopic jars. The body was packed in natron salts, then wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen bandages, each layer blessed with oils and resins that hardened into an aromatic shell. But here's where Tutankhamun's story diverges from other royal mummies. Most pharaohs enjoyed massive tombs carved deep into rock, with walls covered in religious texts and chambers stocked with grave goods. Tutankhamun's tomb was cramped, hastily prepared, apparently intended for someone of lesser rank. Some Egyptologists suggest the boy king's sudden death forced his successors to improvise, grabbing whatever burial space was available and cramming it with treasures in a desperate attempt to ensure his successful journey to the afterlife. What they lacked in space, they made up for in splendor. The burial chamber contained over 50 individual objects, golden chariots, beds shaped like sacred animals, chests filled with clothing, jewelry that would bankrupt small nations, and weapons that were as much art as armament. The famous golden mask alone contains over 20 pounds of solid gold, inlaid with lapis lazuli, carnelian, and colored glass arranged in the ritual patterns that would guide the young king's spirit through the dangers of the underworld. For 3,000 years, this treasure lay undisturbed, while grave robbers systematically looted every other tomb in the valley. Tutankhamun's small size and inconspicuous entrance saved him. Debris from later construction buried his doorway beneath tons of rubble. Flash floods deposited additional layers of sand and stone. The boy king's tomb vanished so completely that ancient maps lost track of its location. Carter had been searching for nearly 6 years when he found those 16 stone steps leading down to a sealed doorway. His methodical grid pattern excavation had covered almost the entire valley floor. Lord Carnarvon was threatening to withdraw funding. This was essentially their last chance, and they'd chosen to dig in what seemed like the least promising spot directly beneath the ruins of ancient workers' huts. The discovery revolutionized Egyptology, but not just because of the treasure. For the first time, archaeologists could study a complete royal burial assemblage, understanding how individual objects related to each other and to the religious beliefs that governed pharaonic afterlife. Previous tomb excavations had recovered scattered artifacts from disturbed contexts. Here was an intact time capsule, a complete sentence written in gold and precious stones. The mummy itself told an equally compelling story. When Carter finally unwrapped Tutankhamun in 1925, he found a young man who had clearly lived a life of luxury but died under mysterious circumstances. The king was well nourished, with perfect teeth and no signs of childhood disease or malnutrition. But CT scans conducted in 2005 revealed a complex pattern of injuries that continue to fuel debate among forensic experts. The most significant damage was a large hole in the back of the skull, initially thought to indicate assassination by blow to the head. However, more sophisticated analysis suggests this damage occurred during mummifications, possibly when embalmers tried to remove brain tissue that had hardened inside the skull. More intriguing are fractures in the chest and a missing heart, unusual for Egyptian mummification practice. Recent DNA analysis has provided additional clues about both Tutankhamun's life and death. He was almost certainly the son of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, the revolutionary king who temporarily abandoned Egypt's traditional gods in favor of worshipping a single solar deity. Tutankhamun's brief reign was largely spent reversing his father's religious reforms, restoring the old gods and their powerful priesthoods. The genetic evidence also reveals that Tutankhamun's parents were siblings, a common practice in royal families, seeking to preserve divine bloodlines, but one that carried genetic risks. The young king suffered from several inherited conditions, including a clubfoot that would have made walking difficult. Dozens of walking sticks found in his tomb suddenly make sense, as do the many images showing him seated during activities where other pharaohs are depicted standing. Perhaps most remarkably, DNA analysis has identified the mummies of Tutankhamun's parents and other relatives, allowing Egyptologists to reconstruct the complex family dynamics of the late 18th dynasty. The young king's wife, Ankhesenamun, was also his half-sister. Two mummified fetuses found in the tomb appear to be their children, both girls who died in infancy, suggesting that genetic problems plagued the entire royal lineage. But beyond the medical mysteries and family intrigue, Tutankhamun's tomb represents something more profound, a complete vision of how ancient Egyptians understood death and transformation. Every object was placed with purpose, from the golden fingertips that would protect the king's hands as he grasped the oars of the solar bark, to the magical amulets sewn between layers of wrapping that would shield him from the demons of the underworld. The tomb's artwork depicts Tutankhamun's journey through death and rebirth, showing him presenting offerings to gods, receiving divine blessings, and finally achieving the ultimate goal of Egyptian religion transformation into a perfected being capable of existing forever in the company of gods. What Carter saw in that first moment of lamplight wasn't just treasure, it was a complete theological argument rendered in gold, a three-dimensional prayer book designed to ensure that one young man would never truly die. When museum visitors today gaze upon Tutankhamun's golden mask, they're looking at the face of someone who achieved exactly what he hoped for: immortality, recognition, and a story that continues to unfold with each new scientific discovery. The boy king who barely mattered in life became archaeology's greatest teacher in death. September 19th, 1991. German hikers Helmut and Erika Simon are descending from the Ötztal Alps when they spot something brown protruding from the melting ice. At first glance, it looks like the remains of an unfortunate mountaineer, perhaps someone who'd fallen into a crevasse and been preserved by the cold. They're half right about the preservation, but spectacularly wrong about the timeline. What they've found is a man who died over 50 years ago, so perfectly preserved by ice and circumstance that he still has fingerprints, intact organs, and identifiable stomach contents. This is Ötzi, the Iceman, and his frozen body is about to rewrite everything we thought we knew about Copper Age Europe. The recovery process reads like a comedy of errors that nearly destroyed one of archaeology's most important discoveries. Initial rescue attempts assumed they were dealing with a modern corpse, so workers used jackhammers and ice picks to chip away at the surrounding ice. They damaged his hip, destroyed some artifacts, and contaminated the site with modern DNA. Only when archaeologists arrived and noticed the strange copper axe did they realize they'd stumbled upon something extraordinary. Transporting Ötzi required a helicopter lift and specially designed freezer systems. His body temperature had to remain constant, humidity carefully controlled, and every surface sterilized to prevent contamination. He now resides in the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Italy, kept at 6 degrees Celsius and 98% humidity, visited through airlocks that maintain his icy environment. But the real excavation happened in laboratories, where forensic pathologists began the most detailed autopsy in archaeological history. What they found was a walking encyclopedia of Copper Age life, death, and technology. Ötzi stood about 5'2" and weighed approximately 110 pounds small by modern standards, but typical for his era. His age at death was roughly 45, practically elderly for the time, and his body bore the accumulated wear of a hard-lived life. His clothing alone revolutionized our understanding of prehistoric textiles and survival techniques. Ötzi wore a sophisticated layered system perfectly adapted to alpine conditions: a leather loincloth, wool leggings held up by a leather belt, a sheepskin coat, a bearskin hat, and waterproof shoes stuffed with grass for insulation. Each piece showed evidence of careful repair and modification, suggesting clothing was precious, maintained across many seasons. The famous copper axe that first alerted archaeologists to his antiquity proved to be a masterpiece of metallurgy. The blade was 99.7% pure copper, hafted to a yew wood handle with leather bindings and birch tar adhesive. This wasn't crude metalworking, it was sophisticated technology that required specialized knowledge of smelting, forging, and tool design. The axe would have been incredibly valuable, marking Ötzi as someone of considerable status in his community. His other possessions paint a picture of a skilled outdoorsman undertaking a serious journey. A longbow made from yew, still unfinished. A quiver containing arrows with flint points and feathers fletching. A leather pouch holding a fire-starting kit flint, pyrite, and tinder fungus. A small copper-bladed knife with the ash wood handle. A net made from grass fibers. Everything chosen for its utility, nothing wasted on decoration. But it's Ötzi's body itself that provides the most intimate glimpse into Copper Age life. His hands showed calluses consistent with regular tool use. His lungs contained particles indicating he spent considerable time around open fires and dusty environments. His teeth were worn down from a gritty diet but showed no cavities. Refined sugars wouldn't reach Europe for millennia. Most remarkably, Ötzi bore over 50 tattoos, making him the world's oldest tattooed human. These weren't decorative designs, but simple lines and crosses positioned precisely over acupuncture points used in traditional Chinese medicine. Recent analysis suggests the tattoos were therapeutic, possibly applied to treat arthritis and other chronic pain conditions. The fact that he bore so many indicates both the prevalence of joint problems in his era and the sophisticated understanding of pain management. His final meal, preserved in his stomach, included ibex meat, red deer, bread made from einkorn wheat, and various plant materials including bracken fern. Pollen analysis of his intestinal contents revealed his movements in the days before death, tracking him from lower valleys up into the high Alps. He'd eaten this final meal about 8 hours before dying, suggesting he was traveling, not residing in the area where he was found. But how did Ötzi die? This question launched thousands of research hours and considerable scientific debate. Initial theories suggested he'd been caught in a sudden storm and died of exposure. CT scans revealed a different story. An arrowhead lodged in his left shoulder, just beneath the shoulder blade. The wound would have severed major blood vessels, causing rapid blood loss and death within minutes. This wasn't an accident. Someone had shot Ötzi from behind, using a flint-tipped arrow similar to those in his own quiver. The angle of entry suggests the archer was positioned below and behind him, perhaps following him up the mountain. Even more intriguingly, DNA analysis of blood found on his copper knife and one of his arrows doesn't match Ötzi's genetic profile. He'd been in combat with at least 2 other people before receiving the fatal wound. The evidence paints a dramatic final act. Ötzi engaged in close combat with multiple opponents, injuring at least 2 of them before fleeing into the high Alps. Hours later, perhaps thinking he'd escaped, he stopped to eat and rest. That's when the arrow found him, fired by someone who'd tracked him to this remote location 0 feet above sea level. Recent analysis has added even more details to this prehistoric murder mystery. Ötzi's fingernails show evidence of significant stress in the weeks before his death, possibly indicating ongoing conflict or hardship. His stomach contained exceptionally high levels of copper particles, suggesting he'd been involved in copper smelting shortly before his death. Some researchers theorize he might have been a copper trader, traveling between communities with valuable metal goods, making him an attractive target for robbery. Genetic analysis has placed Ötzi's ancestry firmly in Central Europe, with his closest living relatives found among populations in Sardinia and Corsica. His DNA carries mutations associated with brown eyes, blood type O, and lactose intolerance, all common traits in Neolithic European populations. More surprisingly, he carried genetic variants linked to increased risk of heart disease, and indeed, CT scans revealed significant arterial calcification. Ötzi's preservation allows us to study not just his death, but his entire life written in flesh and bone. This single individual bridges the gap between archaeological artifacts and lived human experience, showing us that 50 years ago, people faced recognizable challenges: joint pain, heart disease, interpersonal conflict, and the eternal human drive to travel beyond familiar territories. His icebound body carries the literal heartbeat of the Copper Age, still audible to anyone willing to listen carefully to what the past preserved. Heinrich Schliemann was the kind of man who believed absolutely in his own destiny, which in 1871 proved to be either archaeological genius or magnificent self-delusion, probably both. Standing on a windswept hill in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik, he declared with characteristic confidence that beneath his feet lay Troy, legendary city of Priam, Paris, and Helen, the focal point of Homer's epic war. Most scholars thought he was chasing fairy tales. Troy, if it existed at all, was poetry, not history. Homer's Iliad was entertainment, not archaeology. But Schliemann had made a fortune in California, gold rush, commerce, and Russian trade, and fortunes can purchase more than skepticism can prevent. He hired workers, bought permits, and began digging with all the subtlety of a man who believed he was destined to prove the ancient world could be excavated with a pickaxe and absolute certainty. What he found was more complicated than any myth Homer ever crafted. Not one Troy, but 9 cities stacked atop each other like a geological timeline of human ambition. Each generation had built upon the ruins of the last, creating a vertical library of civilizations spanning over 30 years. Reading that library, however, required more patience than Schliemann possessed. His excavation methods were, shall we say, enthusiastic. He dug massive trenches straight through the hill, destroying countless archaeological layers in his haste, to reach what he assumed would be Homeric Troy at the bottom. When he found a cache of golden jewelry and vessels, he smuggled them out of Turkey and declared them Priam's treasure proof that he'd found the royal citadel described in the Iliad. Later, more careful archaeologists would determine that Schliemann's treasure dated to roughly 2,200 BCE, 1,000 years before the Troy of Homer's imagination. But his instinct about the site's importance proved correct, even if his methods would horrify modern excavators. Hisarlik really was Troy, or rather, it was the place where Troy had been, and been, and been again. The deepest levels, Troy the First and the Second, revealed an early Bronze Age settlement that controlled the strategic bottleneck between Europe and Asia. This wasn't the massive city Homer described, but it was clearly important fortified walls, evidence of metalworking, and signs of far-reaching trade connections. Someone thought this hilltop was worth defending, worth rebuilding when enemies destroyed it. Troy VI, dating to roughly 1,250 BCE, finally offered the kind of impressive architecture that could inspire epic poetry. Massive walls constructed from enormous limestone blocks, some weighing over 4 tons, surrounded a citadel that covered nearly 200 square meters. The pottery was sophisticated, clearly influenced by Mycenaean Greek styles. Horses had been introduced, crucial for a story centered on the Trojan horse. This was a city wealthy enough, large enough, and strategically positioned enough to attract the attention of Bronze Age superpowers. But Troy VI ended in earthquake and fire around 1,250 BCE, and its immediate successor, Troy VIII, showed signs of hasty reconstruction, overcrowding, and eventual violent destruction. The timing intrigued archaeologists. If the Trojan War had any historical basis, this destruction level was the most likely candidate. Recent excavations have painted an even more complex picture. The city was larger than Schliemann imagined, extending well beyond the central citadel into a lower town protected by a massive ditch and wooden palisade. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed the outlines of streets, houses, and public buildings covering an area that could have supported a population of several thousand people. More importantly, Troy VIII shows clear evidence of siege warfare. Storage jars sunk into house floors suggest people were stockpiling food for a long blockade. Projectile point arrowheads and spear tips litter the destruction layer. The gates show evidence of being blocked and reinforced, as if defenders were trying to keep attackers out while trapped inside themselves. But here's where archaeology meets mythology in fascinating ways. The Trojan War, as Homer tells it, lasted 10 years, an impossibly long siege by ancient standards. However, Linear B tablets from Mycenaean palaces do record extensive military expeditions to the Troad, the region around Troy during the late Bronze Age. These weren't single battles but extended campaigns, exactly the kind of prolonged conflict that might grow into legendary proportions over centuries of retelling. The archaeological evidence suggests that Troy VIII fell around 1180 BCE, right at the end of the Bronze Age collapse that devastated civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaean palaces that could have launched expeditions against Troy were themselves being destroyed by internal warfare, economic crisis, and possibly climate change. If there was a historical Trojan War, it might have been less about Helen's beauty than about the final death struggles of Bronze Age civilization. But which layer was Homer's Troy? This question has consumed archaeologists for 150 years, and the answer depends on how literally we read the Iliad. If we're looking for a massive city with towering walls and sufficient population to support a 10-year siege, Troy VI fits best. If we want evidence of actual warfare and destruction by fire, Troy VIII offers better archaeological proof. Or perhaps we're asking the wrong question entirely. Homer was composing poetry in the 8th century BCE, drawing on oral traditions that might have preserved memories of multiple conflicts across several centuries. The Trojan War of the Iliad might be a composite creation, blending half-remembered battles, impressive ruins, and the eternal human fascination with stories of love, betrayal, and heroic death. Recent analysis of Hittite archives has added another layer to the puzzle. These cuneiform tablets, written by Troy's neighbors and sometimes enemies, mention a place called Wilusa, linguistically connected to Ilios, Homer's alternative name for Troy. The Hittite records describe conflicts with Wilusa, treaties establishing peaceful relations, and references to a king whose name might be a corrupted version of Alexandru, possibly the historical basis for Homer's Paris, Alexander. Modern excavations continue revealing the complexity of Bronze Age Troy. The city maintained trade connections spanning from the Baltic to the Levant. Amber from northern Europe, tin from Central Asia, ivory from Africa all passed through Troy's markets. This was a cosmopolitan place, exactly the kind of wealthy, strategically important city that might attract both Greek ambitions and poetic imagination. The genius of Schliemann wasn't his methods, those were terrible by any standard. It was his willingness to take ancient literature seriously as a source of historical information. While his contemporaries dismissed Homer as pure fiction, Schliemann believed that myths often preserve kernels of historical truth, distorted by centuries of retelling but still recognizable to anyone willing to dig deep enough. Standing today on the ruins of Hisarlik, you can see across the Dardanelles to the hills where Greek armies might have camped. You can trace the walls of multiple cities, imagine the smoke of siege fires, and understand why this particular hill became the setting for humanity's most enduring war story. Homer's Troy may be literature, but the Troy beneath your feet is history complex, layered, and more fascinating than any single myth could contain. The year was 1939, and Edith Pretty had a problem. Her estate at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, England, featured several mysterious mounds that local legends claimed were Viking burial sites. Mrs. Pretty was curious, bored, and wealthy enough to indulge archaeological hobbies. She hired a local antiquarian named Basil Brown to investigate what everyone assumed would be minor historical curiosities. Brown started with the largest mound, expecting to find a few Viking artifacts and perhaps some medieval pottery. Instead, his careful excavation revealed something that would revolutionize understanding of early medieval Europe, the ghostly outline of a massive ship, its wooden hull long since rotted away, but its iron rivets still marking the precise shape of a vessel nearly 90 feet long. But this wasn't just any ship. Arranged throughout its length was the most spectacular collection of Anglo-Saxon artifacts ever discovered, a treasure trove that transformed the so-called Dark Ages into something brilliant, sophisticated, and connected to trade networks spanning continents. Let's step back to understand what Brown had stumbled upon. The year was approximately 625 CE, and a king was dead. Not just any king, but quite possibly Radwald, ruler of the East Angles and, according to Bede's ecclesiastical history, Bretwaldo overlord of all Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. His death required a funeral worthy of his status, drawing on traditions that stretched back to the mist-shrouded forests of Germanic Europe. The funeral ship itself tells a remarkable story. Oak-built, clinker-planked, and designed for both rowing and sailing, It represented the cutting edge of early medieval maritime technology. This was a royal vessel, capable of carrying the king and his warband across the North Sea in both reality and, presumably, in whatever afterlife awaited Anglo-Saxon nobles. But the ship was never intended to sail again. Instead, it was dragged nearly a mile inland from the nearest navigable water, positioned precisely in a trench dug specifically to receive it, then filled with grave goods that read like an inventory of early medieval power, artistry, and international connections. The most famous artifact is the Helmeta masterpiece of metalworking that combines practical protection with symbolic magnificence. Reconstructed from hundreds of fragments, it features a full-face mask with garnet-inlaid eyebrows, a nose guard decorated with interlacing serpents, and cheek pieces that transform the wearer into something between warrior and supernatural being. The craftsmanship rivals anything produced in the contemporary Byzantine Empire, yet it was created in what historians long dismissed as barbarous post-Roman Britain. Alongside the helmet lay a sword of extraordinary quality. The pattern-welded blade showed techniques that wouldn't be surpassed until the development of crucible steel centuries later. The pommel was solid gold, the scabbard decorated with garnet cloisonné work so intricate that modern jewelers struggle to replicate the techniques. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of kingship, possibly passed down through generations of East Anglian rulers. The gold belt buckle defies everything we thought we knew about Dark Age artistic capabilities. Weighing over a pound of solid gold, it features interlaced animal patterns of mind-bending complexity serpents, birds, and quadrupeds writhing in patterns that seem to move in peripheral vision. The craftsmanship required not just artistic skill but mathematical precision, with each curve calculated to create optical effects that modern designers achieve with computer assistance. But perhaps most remarkably, the grave goods revealed trade connections that spanned the known world. Garnets came from India or Sri Lanka, traveling trade routes that connected the Indian Ocean to the North Sea. Silver bowls showed Byzantine craftsmanship, possibly diplomatic gifts or spoils of war. A set of silver spoons bore Greek inscriptions, suggesting Christian influence in a burial that was otherwise thoroughly pagan. The presence of these exotic materials forces us to reconsider the entire concept of the Dark Ages. This wasn't a period of isolation and barbarism, but an era of cultural fusion where Germanic traditions combined with Roman administrative knowledge, Celtic artistic techniques, and trade goods from as far away as the Middle East and Central Asia. The burial also included more intimate objects that humanized this distant king. A purse containing 40 gold coins, not random currency, but a carefully selected collection including Merovingian tremisses that help date the burial to the early 7th century. Gaming pieces carved from whalebone, suggesting royal leisure, involved strategy games. A wooden lyre that would have accompanied the recitation of heroic poetry in the king's hall. Most poignantly, the burial contained a pair of silver spoons inscribed with the names Saulos and Paulos, Greek for Saul and Paul, suggesting they might have been baptismal gifts. If the buried king was indeed Radwald, this aligns perfectly with Bede's account of a ruler who hedged his bets between Christianity and paganism, maintaining altars to both Christ and traditional Germanic gods. The ship burial tradition itself reveals the complex cultural identity of Anglo-Saxon England. These weren't simply Germanic pagans maintaining ancestral customs, but sophisticated people adapting Scandinavian traditions to English circumstances. The practice of ship burial was relatively rare even in Scandinavia, reserved for individuals of exceptional status. At Sutton Hoo, it represented a conscious statement about royal identity and cultural continuity in a rapidly changing world. Recent analysis has revealed even more about the burial's significance. Isotope analysis of metal objects shows that materials came from mines across Europetin from Cornwall, lead from the Peak District, silver from continental sources. The economic networks required to assemble such materials suggest royal authority that extended far beyond traditional tribal boundaries. The textiles, preserved only as impressions in corroded metal, included silk that could only have come from Byzantine or even Chinese sources. Fragments of fur suggest Arctic fox and beaver pelts, indicating trade connections reaching into the far north. This wasn't just wealth, it was a curated collection representing the geographic and cultural extent of early medieval European civilization. But who was buried in this ship? Nobody was ever found, leading to decades of speculation. Soil analysis suggests a body was indeed placed in the burial chamber, but the acidic Suffolk soil dissolved organic materials completely. Recent chemical analysis has detected phosphate concentrations consistent with human remains, confirming that this was indeed a burial, not a cenotaph. The dating evidence points most strongly toward Radwald, who died around 625 CE and was remembered as the most powerful Anglo-Saxon king of his generation. But other candidates include his son Eorpwald, or possibly an unknown king whose name didn't survive in written records. The uncertainty adds to, rather than detracts from the burial's significance. It represents not just one individual but an entire royal culture at the moment of its greatest flowering. The Sutton Hoo ship burial stands as perhaps the single most important archaeological discovery for understanding early medieval Europe. It revealed that the so-called Dark Ages were neither dark nor isolated, but represented a period of remarkable cultural synthesis when Germanic traditions, Roman administrative knowledge, Celtic artistry, and Christian symbolism combined to create something entirely new. When Basil Brown's careful excavation revealed those iron ship rivets in the Suffolk soil, he wasn't just uncovering a burial, he was revealing the moment when England began to emerge as a distinct cultural entity, drawing on traditions from across Europe while developing its own unique identity. The ghost ship of Sutton Hoo carried more than a dead king into eternity. It carried the birth certificate of a civilization. Picture this: 3.6 million years ago, in what is now northern Tanzania, a family of early hominins walks across a landscape of volcanic ash. Perhaps they're searching for water, fleeing danger, or simply moving between feeding areas. They have no idea that their footsteps are being preserved for eternity, fossilized in a medium that will capture not just where they walked, but how they walked, and possibly even glimpses of their social relationships. Fast forward to 1976, when paleoanthropologist Mary Leakey is leading an expedition at a site called Laetoli. Her team has been finding fossilized animal tracks in hardened volcanic deposits. Interesting, but not revolutionary. Then, expedition member Andrew Hill, dodging a playfully thrown piece of elephant dung, falls down and finds himself face to face with something extraordinary. A line of circular depressions in the rock that look suspiciously like footprints. Human footprints. What Leakey's team uncovered over the following excavation seasons was unprecedented in paleoanthropologia: 80-foot-long trackway, preserving the footprints of at least 3 individuals walking across volcanic ash that had been dampened by rain, then dried and hardened by subsequent ashfalls from the nearby Sadiman volcano. The preservation was so perfect that you could see individual toe impressions, heel strikes, and the subtle biomechanical details that reveal how our ancestors moved across the ancient landscape. The dating was revolutionary. Potassium-argon analysis of the volcanic tuff placed the footprints at 3.6 million years old, making them by far the oldest direct evidence of hominin bipedalism ever discovered. This wasn't indirect evidence inferred from bone structure. These were actual footprints, the literal steps of our ancestors preserved in stone. But it was the gait analysis that truly changed everything we thought we knew about early human locomotion. When biomechanics experts studied the trackway, they found that these ancient walkers moved with fully modern bipedal gaits. The heel-to-toe progression, the stride length relative to body size, the narrow spacing between left and right footprints all indicated that 3.6 million years ago, hominins had already perfected the walking style that characterizes modern humans. This finding demolished previous theories about gradual bipedal evolution. Instead of a long, slow transition from knuckle walking to upright locomotion, the Laetoli tracks suggested that once hominins committed to bipedalism, they developed efficient walking gaits relatively quickly. The individuals who made these tracks weren't shambling proto-humans struggling with new forms of locomotion. They were confident walkers who could cover long distances across varied terrain. The size analysis of the footprints revealed even more intriguing details. The trackway preserves the steps of at least 3 individuals. one large, probably adult male, one medium-sized, probably adult female, and one small, possibly juvenile. The spacing and direction of their tracks suggested they were walking together, as a group, in the same direction. Some researchers have proposed even more specific interpretations. The medium-sized individual's tracks occasionally overlap or fall very close to the large individual's prints, suggesting they might have been walking side by side, perhaps with the smaller individual using the larger one's steps as guidance. One romantic interpretation suggests we're seeing a mated pair walking together with their offspring, a 3.6 million-year-old snapshot of family life. More controversial is evidence that might indicate a fourth individual whose tracks partially overlap the others. Some researchers see hints of additional footprints, possibly from someone who walked the same path shortly after the original three. Others dismiss these as preservation artifacts or coincidental marks in the volcanic ash. The preservation itself tells a fascinating story about ancient climate and volcanic activity. The Sadiman volcano was actively erupting during this period, regularly coating the landscape with fine volcanic ash. When this ash was dampened by seasonal rains, it created a surface with the perfect consistency for recording footprints, soft enough to receive impressions, but stable enough to hold them until the next ashfall could bury and preserve them. This creates a kind of geological time-lapse photography. The Laetoli site preserves multiple surfaces with animal tracks from different time periods, creating a vertical sequence that shows how the local fauna changed over thousands of years. Alongside the hominin tracks, paleontologists have found the footprints of elephants, rhinos, giraffes, antelopes, birds, and even insects, a complete ecosystem frozen in volcanic time. Recent technological advances have revealed additional details invisible to earlier researchers. High-resolution 3D scanning has captured the subtle contours of individual footprints with millimeter precision, allowing for sophisticated biomechanical analysis. These studies have confirmed that the Laetoli walkers had fully developed plantar arches, the curved foot structure that makes human long-distance walking so efficient. The tracks also reveal information about body size and proportions. Based on footprint dimensions and stride lengths, researchers estimate that the largest individual stood about 4.5 feet tall and weighed roughly 100 pounds small by modern standards, but consistent with other Australopithecus afarensis specimens from the same time period. Perhaps most remarkably, the tracks preserve evidence of individual variation in walking style. The largest individual shows a slightly more rolling gait, possibly indicating different muscle development or minor biomechanical differences. The smallest tracks show the shorter, more variable stride length typical of juveniles, still learning to coordinate complex walking movements. But who made these tracks? The dating places them squarely within the time range of Australopithecus afarensis, the species that includes the famous Lucy skeleton discovered just 2 years before the Laetoli footprints. The foot proportions and inferred body sizes match what we know about A. afarensis from skeletal remains, strongly suggesting these tracks were made by the same species. This connection between footprints and skeletal evidence provides an unprecedented opportunity to understand how fossil species actually lived and moved. Lucy's skeleton told us that A. afarensis had the anatomical equipment for bipedalism, the right hip structure, leg proportions, and spinal curvature. The Laetoli tracks show us that they used this equipment with remarkable efficiency. Recent discoveries have expanded our understanding of the Laetoli site. Additional excavations have uncovered more trackways, including evidence of even older footprints dating to 3.7 million years ago. These discoveries confirm that the area was repeatedly used by hominin groups over extended periods, suggesting it was an important part of their territorial range. The preservation of the Laetoli tracks required a perfect storm of geological circumstances that's unlikely to be repeated. The right volcanic activity, the right rainfall patterns, the right soil chemistry, and the right timing for burial and fossilization. It's a reminder that the fossil record preserves only the tiniest fraction of ancient life, and that most of our ancestors' footsteps have vanished without a trace. But these particular footsteps endure, carrying us back to a moment when 3 individuals walked across an African landscape, unaware that they were leaving behind the most intimate evidence of how our species learned to walk upright. In their fossilized footprints, we can trace not just their path across ancient terrain, but humanity's first steps toward becoming the traveling species that would eventually walk to every corner of the Earth. In 1932, a road crew working near Clovis, New Mexico, made a discovery that would revolutionize our understanding of when humans first arrived in the Americas. While excavating gravel for highway construction, they uncovered the bones of extinct bison mixed with stone tools of exquisite craftsmanship fluted spear points, unlike anything previously known from North American archaeology. The implications were staggering. These weren't the crude stone implements that 1930s archaeologists expected from primitive peoples. They were sophisticated weapons, as sharp as surgical steel and more elegantly designed than most modern knife blades. And they were found alongside the remains of animals that had been extinct for over 10 years. The dating sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Radiocarbon analysis placed the Clovis site at approximately 500 years old, pushing back the earliest evidence of human presence in North America by thousands of years. Suddenly, the New World wasn't so new. It had been home to skilled hunter-gatherers for over 13 millennia. But it was the stone points themselves that truly captured scientific imagination. Clovis points are instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with prehistoric technology. Leaf-shaped, with distinctive fluted channels running from the base toward the tip on both faces. These flutes weren't decorative, they were sophisticated engineering solutions that allowed the points to be hafted securely to wooden or bone shafts while maintaining perfect balance and aerodynamic properties. Creating a Clovis point required extraordinary skill. The napper had to select the right kind of stone, usually high-quality chert, obsidian, or flint, then carefully shape it through a complex sequence of precise strikes. The fluting process alone was incredibly risky. One wrong blow could shatter hours of careful work. Archeological experiments suggest that even expert modern flint nappers fail to produce successful flutes about 50% of the time. The technical sophistication implied by Clovis points challenged fundamental assumptions about Paleo-Indian capabilities. These weren't desperate survivors struggling to adapt to a harsh new continent. They were master craftspeople whose stone tool technology wouldn't be surpassed until the development of metal weapons thousands of years later. As more Clovis sites were discovered across North America, a remarkable pattern emerged. From Alaska to Mexico, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, Clovis points showed remarkable consistency in design and manufacturing technique. This suggested either rapid migration by a single cultural group or efficient transmission of technological knowledge across vast distances in a very short time period. The geographical distribution of Clovis sites tells the story of a successful continental colonization. The earliest sites cluster in the Great Plains and Southwest, then spread outward in all directions. Within a few centuries, Clovis people had reached every major ecosystem in North America: forests, plains, deserts, mountains, and coastal regions. This represents one of the most rapid territorial expansions in human history. But who were the Clovis people, and where did they come from? Genetic evidence from modern Native American populations points to Asian origins, consistent with migration across the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age. The land bridge, called Beringia, connected Siberia and Alaska when sea levels were much lower than today, creating a vast grassland that supported large herds of mammoths, horses, and bison. The timing of Clovis' arrival coincides with a remarkable phenomenon, the end. Pleistocene extinction event that eliminated most of North America's megafauna. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dozens of other large species vanished forever. The correlation is so strong that it sparked decades of debate about the role of human hunting in these extinctions. Clovis sites preserve direct evidence of hunting large prey. At several locations, archaeologists have found mammoth and mastodon skeletons with Clovis points embedded in the bones or scattered nearby. These kill sites show that Clovis hunters were capable of taking down the largest animals on the continent, using sophisticated tactics that probably involved group coordination and detailed knowledge of animal behavior. The famous Colby site in Wyoming preserves evidence of mammoth processing on an industrial scale. Archaeologists found the remains of at least 7 mammoths arranged in neat piles, with stone tools and bone fragments scattered throughout the area. The systematic butchering patterns suggest these hunters knew exactly how to process massive carcasses efficiently, probably to prepare meat for long-term storage. But Clovis people weren't just mammoth hunters. Sites across the continent show they exploited a wide range of resources: bison, deer, rabbits, birds, fish, and numerous plant foods. They were generalized foragers who could adapt quickly to different environments, a flexibility that probably contributed to their rapid continental expansion. Recent discoveries have complicated the traditional Clovis first model of American colonization. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile and Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania have produced evidence of human presence that predates Clovis by thousands of years. These pre-Clovis sites suggest that multiple waves of migration might have brought different groups to the Americas at different times. Genetic research has added another layer of complexity. DNA analysis of ancient remains and modern populations indicates that the ancestors of Native Americans diverged from Asian populations much earlier than the Clovis timeline would suggest. Some studies point to initial separation over 20 years ago, with populations remaining isolated in Beringia for thousands of years before moving south into the Americas. This has led to new theories about American colonization. Instead of a single rapid migration, some researchers propose a more complex scenario involving multiple groups, different migration routes, and longer timescales. Some early Americans might have traveled along the Pacific coast by boat, island hopping down from Alaska to South America without leaving traces on the ice-covered interior of the continent. The coastal migration theory helps explain some puzzling aspects of early American archaeology. Why do some of the earliest sites appear in South America, thousands of miles from the supposed Beringian entry point? How did people reach islands like the Channel Islands off California so early in the colonization process? Watercraft technology might provide answers to these questions. Recent analysis of Clovis points has revealed additional surprises about their makers. Residue analysis has identified blood and other organic materials from a wide range of prey species, confirming that these tools were used for hunting diverse animals. Microscopic wear patterns show they were also used for processing plant materials, suggesting more complex subsistence strategies than traditional big-game hunting models assumed. Perhaps most remarkably, some Clovis points show evidence of curation and resharpening over extended periods. These weren't disposable tools, but valuable possessions that were maintained, repaired, and possibly passed down through generations. The investment of time and skill required to create a perfect Clovis point made each one precious in a world where the right weapon could mean the difference between feast and famine. The Clovis phenomenon represents more than just archaeological evidence. It's the story of human adaptability and innovation in the face of environmental challenges. These early Americans didn't just survive in unfamiliar landscapes, they thrived, developing new technologies and strategies that allowed them to become the ancestors of millions of indigenous people across 2 continents. Standing in a museum today, looking at a Clovis point displayed under glass, you're seeing one of humanity's greatest technological achievements, a tool so perfectly designed that its basic principles influenced projectile point manufacture for thousands of years afterward. In its fluted surfaces and razor-sharp edges, you can read the story of how humans learned to make themselves at home in a new world, one perfectly knapped stone at a time. In the ruins of ancient Nineveh, buried beneath centuries of dust and deliberate destruction, lay the world's first great Libraria collection that would revolutionize our understanding of Mesopotamian civilization and preserve humanity's oldest literary masterpieces. This was the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of Assyria, and its rediscovery in the 1850s opened a window into the ancient world that scholars are still exploring today. Ashurbanipal ruled the Assyrian Empire from 668 to 627 BCE, at the height of its power when Assyrian armies controlled territory from Egypt to Iran. But unlike his warrior predecessors, this king harbored an unusual obsession. He wanted to collect all the knowledge in the world. Not just Assyrian knowledge, but the accumulated wisdom of every culture his empire had conquered. The scale of his ambition was unprecedented. Royal scribes scoured the empire, copying texts from temple libraries, private collections, and scholarly schools. They translated works from Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and other languages into the cuneiform script that Assyrian scholars could read. The king's agents essentially conducted the world's first systematic campaign of cultural preservation, though they weren't necessarily gentle about it. When British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard began excavating Nineveh in 1849, he had no idea what he was about to unleash. His workers uncovered room after room filled with broken clay, tablet stones of thousands of them, scattered and jumbled by the collapse of the palace roof and centuries of weathering. What looked like archaeological debris was actually the remains of the most comprehensive library the ancient world had ever seen. The tablets themselves tell the story of the library's creation and organization. Many bear Colophon's ancient library stamps identifying them as property of the palace of Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Assyria. Some include detailed acquisition information, noting which city or temple the text was copied from, who did the copying, and when the work was completed. It was a systematic cataloging project that would make modern librarians proud. But it was the content of these tablets that truly revolutionized ancient Near Eastern studies. Among the fragments, scholars discovered the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest known work of literature. The Ashurbanipal version was more complete than any previously known copy, revealing plot details and poetic passages that had been lost for millennia. When British Museum curator George Smith first deciphered the flood narrative in 1872, he became so excited that he reportedly began stripping off his clothes and dancing around the room. The Gilgamesh discovery was just the beginning. The library contained thousands of literary works, historical chronicles, scientific treatises, mathematical tablets, astronomical observations, medical prescriptions, and religious texts. There were dictionaries and lexicons for translating between different languages, collections of omens for predicting the future, and detailed records of royal correspondence and administrative decisions. The omen literature alone provides fascinating insights into Assyrian worldview and scientific method. These weren't random superstitions, but systematic attempts to correlate observed phenomena with subsequent events. Scribes recorded the appearance of clouds, the behavior of animals, the shapes of oil drops on water, and thousands of other observations, then noted what happened afterward. Over generations, this created vast databases of correlational data that represented the ancient world's most sophisticated attempts at predictive science. The library's medical texts reveal equally impressive systematic thinking. Assyrian physicians documented symptoms, treatments, and outcomes with remarkable precision. They recorded surgical procedures, pharmaceutical recipes using hundreds of different plants and minerals, and diagnostic techniques that wouldn't look out of place in a modern medical textbook. Some treatments show genuine insight into anatomy and physiology, while others reflect the era's supernatural explanations for disease. Mathematical and astronomical texts demonstrate the sophisticated computational abilities of Mesopotamian scholars. They had developed place value notation, advanced techniques for calculating areas and volumes, and astronomical models that could predict eclipses and planetary movements with impressive accuracy. The famous Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, preserved in Ashurbanipal's collection, contains observations of Venus's synodic period that are accurate to within hours. But perhaps most remarkably, the library preserved extensive historical records that allow us to reconstruct the political and military history of the entire ancient Near East. Royal annals, diplomatic correspondence, tribute lists, and military reports provide detailed accounts of conquests, rebellions, treaties, and political intrigues spanning centuries. These texts have allowed historians to create precise chronologies and understand the complex international relationships of the Bronze and Iron Ages. The organization of the library reveals Ashurbanipal's scholarly methods. Texts were grouped by subject matter, with separate sections for literature, history, science, religion, and administration. Within each category, works were arranged systematically, often with cross-references to related material in other sections. The king apparently spent considerable time in his library, as evidenced by tablets bearing notes in his own handwriting and references to his personal reading preferences. Ashurbanipal's scribes didn't just copy texts, they also created new editions, comparing different versions of the same work and noting textual variants. Some tablets contain scholarly commentaries, explaining difficult passages or providing historical context for ancient works. This represents some of the world's earliest textual criticism and philological scholarship. The library's destruction came during the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE, when a coalition of Babylonians and Medes finally conquered the Assyrian capital. The palace was burned, the roof collapsed, and thousands of clay tablets were scattered and broken. Ironically, the fire that destroyed the library also preserved it. The intense heat baked the clay tablets harder than their original firing, ensuring their survival for over 2 millennia. Recovery and translation of the library's contents has been ongoing for over 150 years, and scholars estimate that significant portions remain undeciphered. Many tablets exist only as fragments, requiring painstaking work to match pieces and reconstruct complete texts. Digital imaging and computational analysis are now being used to identify joins between fragments and enhance the readability of worn cuneiform signs. Recent discoveries continue to reveal the library's treasures. In 2014, researchers identified a previously unknown worker, Babylonian account of Noah's flood, that predates the biblical version by centuries. Other recent finds include astronomical diaries, pharmaceutical recipes, and literary works that expand our understanding of ancient Mesopotamian culture. The Library of Ashurbanipal represents more than just an archaeological discovery. It's a testament to the power of knowledge preservation and the continuity of human intellectual tradition. When Ashurbanipal's scribes copied ancient Sumerian texts that were already thousands of years old, they were performing the same function as modern libraries and digital archives, ensuring that human knowledge survives the rise and fall of civilizations. Today, as we digitize ancient texts and make them available to scholars worldwide, we're continuing the work that Ashurbanipal began over 600 years ago. His library reminds us that the urge to collect, preserve, and transmit knowledge is one of humanity's most enduring characteristics and one of our most important tools for understanding who we are and where we came from. The year was 1982, and sponge diver Mehmed Chakir was working the waters off Kash, Turkey, when he spotted something unusual on the seabed 150 feet below the surface. Bronze ingots scattered across the bottom like ancient coins dropped by careless gods. What Chakir had discovered was the Uluburun shipwrecker Bronze Age time capsule that would revolutionize our understanding of ancient trade, diplomacy, and the interconnected nature of the late Bronze Age world. The ship that sank here around 1300 BCE was carrying what can only be described as the ancient world's most valuable cargo. When archaeologists from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology began systematic excavation under the direction of George Bass and Seymour Pulack, they uncovered a floating museum of Bronze Age luxury goods, raw materials, and exotic artifacts from across the known world. The excavation itself was an underwater archaeological marathon spanning 11 seasons from 1984 to 1994. Working at depths that required technical diving equipment and careful decompression protocols, archaeologists mapped and recovered over 17 individual artifacts. Every piece had to be carefully documented in its original position before being brought to the surface, a process complicated by currents, limited bottom time, and the challenging logistics of deep water archaeology. But what they found was worth every moment of those painstaking underwater excavations. The ship's cargo reads like an inventory of Bronze Age globalization, containing raw materials and finished goods from at least a dozen different cultures spanning from Britain to East Africa. This wasn't just a merchant vessel, it was a floating exhibition of late Bronze Age international commerce at its most sophisticated. The bulk cargo consisted of raw materials that formed the backbone of Bronze Age technology. 10 tons of copper ingots, their surfaces still bearing the markings of ancient smelters, came from Cyprus, the island, whose very name gives us the word copper. 1 ton of tin ingots, essential for bronze making but geographically rare, probably originated in the mountains of Afghanistan or Central Asia. The presence of both copper and tin in such quantities suggests this ship was carrying everything needed to supply bronze-working industries across the eastern Mediterranean. But the exotic finished goods tell an even more remarkable story of ancient trade networks. There were elephant ivory tusks from Africa, hippopotamus teeth from the Nile, ostrich eggshells worked into decorative vessels, and amber from the Baltic Sea materials that had traveled thousands of miles before ending up on this doomed vessel. The glass ingots found in the wreck represent some of the earliest evidence for large-scale glass production and trade. Chemical analysis has traced these cobalt blue and turquoise raw glass blocks to production centers in Mesopotamia, showing that glass-making technology was already sophisticated enough to support international commerce over 30 years ago. Among the most intriguing discoveries was a golden scarab bearing the cartouche of Nefertiti, the famous queen of Egypt. This wasn't just any royal jewelry, it was a piece that could only have come from the highest levels of Egyptian court society. Its presence on the ship suggests diplomatic gifts, royal trade missions, or possibly even the personal possessions of a high-ranking Egyptian official traveling on diplomatic business. The ship also carried what appears to be scrap metal destined for recycling broken bronze tools, damaged weapons, and worn-out implements that would have been melted down and recast into new objects. This reveals another dimension of Bronze Age economics, the systematic recycling of valuable metals that were too precious to waste. Organic materials preserved in the ship's cargo provide intimate glimpses into ancient diet and agriculture. Pomegranates, figs, and grapes suggest Mediterranean origins, while coriander seeds and safflower indicate trade connections extending into Asia. Most remarkably, the ship carried what appear to be samples of frankincense and myrexotic resins from Arabia that were among the most valuable trade goods of the ancient world. The pottery assemblage reveals the ship's probable route and the complexity of Bronze Age ceramic production. Jars from Cyprus, storage vessels from the Levantine coast, and fine tableware from various Aegean cultures suggest a trading circuit that connected multiple production centers with diverse consumer markets. Some vessels still contained their original content traces of terebinth resin, probably used for waterproofing or medicine. But perhaps most fascinating was the discovery of what archaeologists call the captain's cabin, a small area containing personal possessions that reveal the human side of ancient maritime commerce. There was a cylinder seal from Mesopotamia, possibly belonging to a merchant or official, writing tablets that might have contained shipping manifests or diplomatic correspondence, and personal jewelry including rings, bracelets, and pendants from various cultural traditions. The weapons found on the ship tell their own story about Bronze Age conflict and security. Swords, spearheads, arrowheads, and daggers represented multiple metalworking traditions, some clearly Mycenaean, others showing Levantine influences, and still others that appear to be Egyptian in style. This wasn't just trade merchandise, but a working arsenal that reflects the dangers of ancient maritime commerce. Recent analysis using advanced scientific techniques has revealed even more about the ship's cargo and origins. Lead isotope analysis of the metal ingots has traced copper sources to specific mines in Cyprus and tin sources to deposits in Central Asia. This kind of precision allows archaeologists to map ancient trade routes with unprecedented accuracy. The wood from the ship's hull, preserved by the marine environment, has been identified as Lebanese cedarth, same species used to build Solomon's temple and prized throughout the ancient world for its durability and workability. Dendrochronological analysis of the wood suggests the ship was built around 1400 BCE, making it roughly a century old when it sank. The Uluburun wreck has fundamentally changed how archaeologists understand Bronze Age economics and politics. Rather than isolated civilizations occasionally trading with neighbors, the evidence points to a truly international economy where raw materials, finished goods, and luxury items moved freely across vast distances. The scale and sophistication of this trade network rivals anything seen before the Roman Empire. The ship's probable route can be reconstructed from its cargo origins. Starting possibly in the Levant, it would have sailed to Cyprus for copper, then to various Aegean ports for pottery and other manufactured goods, with stops in Egypt for luxury items and diplomatic gifts. The presence of African materials suggests connections to Red Sea trade routes that brought goods from Nubia and Punt. But the Uluburun ship was more than just a commercial venture. It was a floating diplomatic mission that carried not just trade goods, but gifts between royal courts, technological knowledge between craftsmen, and cultural influences between civilizations. The diversity of its cargo suggests it was serving multiple functions: merchant vessel, diplomatic courier, and cultural ambassador all at once. When this remarkable ship went down in the waters off ancient Anatolia, it took with it a snapshot of Bronze Age globalization at its peak. The cargo represents the fruits of international cooperation, technological exchange, and economic integration that wouldn't be seen again until the classical period over 500 years later. Today, as we struggle to understand our own globalized world, the Uluburun wreck reminds us that international trade, cultural exchange, and economic interdependence are not modern innovations but fundamental aspects of human civilization that stretch back over 3 millennia. In its scattered bronze ingots and exotic cargo, we can read the story of humanity's first global economy and perhaps glimpse our own reflection in those ancient depths. The morning mist clings to Andean peaks like ancient breath, and somewhere in that ethereal dance between earth and sky, history waits to be rediscovered. It's 1911, and the world still believes the Inca Empire died with Atahualpa's execution. What could possibly remain of a civilization that Spanish conquistadors claimed to have thoroughly erased? Hiram Bingham III, Yale professor and part-time romantic, certainly didn't expect to stumble upon the archaeological find of the century. He'd come to Peru chasing rumors of lost cities, armed with more enthusiasm than expertise. The local Quechua guides who led him up these impossible ridges knew better. They'd been quietly tending the terraces for generations, treating the ruins not as lost civilization but as living heritage. Picture the moment when Bingham first glimpsed those impossibly precise stone walls emerging from the cloud forest. Machu Picchu revealed itself like a fever dream-made manifestation, entire city, perched on a knife edge between peaks, its architecture so seamlessly integrated with the natural topography that it seemed less built than grown. The terraces cascaded down the mountainside in mathematical precision, each level a testament to engineering that made European castle builders look like enthusiastic amateurs. These weren't simply agricultural platforms, they were sophisticated hydraulic systems, earthquake-resistant foundations, and ceremonial spaces all rolled into one elegant solution. The Inca had essentially terraformed a mountain. Water flowed through channels carved with surgical precision, following gradients calculated to the millimeter. During the rainy season, the entire complex became a controlled waterfall, every drop guided exactly where it needed to go. In the dry months, hidden reservoirs sustained the gardens that fed the royal court. It was urban planning that wouldn't look out of place in a modern eco-city. But Machu Picchu's true genius revealed itself in its astronomical alignments. The Intihuatana stone, that enigmatic carved outcrop at the city's heart, tracked the sun's annual journey with clockwork precision. During winter solstice, the sun settled directly over the stone without casting a shadow, a moment when, according to Inca belief, the solar deity was symbolically tethered to Earth. Windows in the Temple of the Sun framed specific peaks during celestial events, turning the entire mountain range into a cosmic calendar. The Inca didn't just live in their landscape, they made it perform for them, choreographing earth and sky into a single, unified stage for royal ritual. Bingham's photographs, when they finally reached the outside world, shattered every assumption about pre-Columbian civilization. Here was sophisticated architecture that required no mortar, its stones fitted with such precision that 5 centuries of earthquakes couldn't shift them. Here were agricultural innovations that sustained thousands of people on seemingly impossible terrain. Here was proof that the Americas had produced urban planning to rival anything in the Old World. The discovery forced archaeologists to completely reconsider Inca capabilities. These weren't the primitive mountain dwellers that colonial histories described, but masterful engineers who'd solved problems that stumped modern city planners. They'd created sustainable agriculture on vertical cliffsides, managed water resources across entire watersheds, and built structures that flexed with seismic activity rather than resisting it. Perhaps most remarkably, they'd done it all without writing, using instead a complex system of knotted strings called quipu to record everything from tax obligations to astronomical observations. Machu Picchu became a Rosetta Stone for understanding this alternative path to civilization known that prioritized harmony with natural systems over dominance of them. Today, as climate change forces us to reconsider our relationship with the environment, the cloud city above the Urubamba River feels less like ancient history and more like prophecy. The Inca's sustainable terraces still produce crops, their water management still prevents erosion, their earthquake-resistant construction still stands. Sometimes the future is found by looking backward. In 1879, an 8-year-old girl named Maria Sanz de Sautuola was exploring a cave with her father while he searched for prehistoric tools. Children, as any parent knows, have an uncanny ability to notice what adults overlook, and Maria happened to glance upward at exactly the right moment. "Papa, look! Painted bulls!" What she'd discovered on the ceiling of Altamira Cave would trigger the first great scandal of prehistoric archaeology. The bison that danced across that limestone canvas were rendered with such artistic sophistication that the European establishment declared them impossible. Primitive cave dwellers, they insisted, could never have created art of such quality. The paintings were clearly modern forgeries. Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola, Maria's father, found himself at the center of a scientific firestorm. His background as an amateur archaeologist made him an easy target for professional skepticism. Here was a Spanish gentleman farmer claiming to have found Paleolithic Sistine Chapel in his local cave system. The French authorities, who considered themselves the arbiters of prehistoric research, were particularly dismissive. The controversy revealed more about 19th century prejudices than about cave art. How could primitive humans barely evolved beyond apes, according to prevailing theory, have possessed the artistic vision to capture animal movement with such fluid grace? The Altamira bison seemed to breathe on the rock face, their bodies rendered with an understanding of anatomy that rivaled Renaissance masters. For nearly 2 decades, Sautuola endured academic exile while his discovery was dismissed as elaborate hoax. The irony was exquisite. The same scientific community that had eagerly accepted Darwin's evolutionary theory couldn't wrap their heads around the possibility that early humans had been capable of sophisticated artistic expression. The vindication, when it finally came, was as swift as the condemnation had been harsh. Henri Breuil, the young French priest who would become prehistory's founding father, visited Altamira in 1902 and immediately recognized the painting's authenticity. The pigments had been sealed beneath limestone formations that clearly predated recorded history. The artistic techniques matched other cave art being discovered across Europe. Most damning to the skeptics was the simple fact that many of the animals depicted had been extinct for millennia. The cave painters hadn't just imagined these creatures, they'd lived alongside them, observed them, hunted them. The art was witness testimony from the Ice Age. Breuil's endorsement opened floodgates of discovery. Suddenly, caves across France and Spain were revealing galleries that pushed back the origins of human artistic expression by tens of thousands of years. Font de Gaume, Les Combarelles, Lascaux site added new chapters to the story of our creative ancestors. The Altamira paintings themselves told a more complex narrative than anyone had initially realized. These weren't crude stick figures or simple animal outlines, but sophisticated compositions that used the cave wall's natural contours to create three-dimensional effects. A bulge in the limestone became a bison's shoulder, a crack suggested a spear wound. The interplay of shadow and pigment brought static images to flickering life in torchlight. Radiocarbon dating would eventually reveal that these masterpieces were created across vast spans of timesome paintings separated by thousands of years, yet maintaining consistent artistic traditions across centuries of human generations. The caves had served as galleries, workshops, and sacred spaces for countless communities. But perhaps the most profound revelation was what the art revealed about Ice Age consciousness. These weren't mere hunting records or primitive decoration, but evidence of minds capable of abstract thought, symbolic representation, and aesthetic judgment. The cave painters had been fully modern humans, neurologically identical to us, possessed of the same capacity for wonder and creative expression. The animals they painted, mammoth, cave lions, woolly rhinoceros, inhabited a world so different from our own that it might as well be another planet. Yet the artistic impulse that drove those ancient hands to mix ochre and charcoal, to climb deep into lightless caverns and create beauty where no one might ever see it again, remains immediately recognizable. Maria's innocent observation had shattered the Victorian notion of linear progress, the comfortable assumption that civilization moved in steady steps from primitive to sophisticated. The cave painters of Altamira proved that human creativity had emerged fully formed, that our ancestors possessed artistic vision that we're still struggling to understand. In the end, it took a child's fresh eyes to see what academic expertise had missed, that our species has been making art for as long as we've been recognizably human, leaving beauty in the deepest darkness as proof of our passage through time. From the ground, they're almost invisible faint lines scratched into desert hardpan, seemingly random scratches that might have been made by geological accident or agricultural accident, but rise 500 feet into the Peruvian sky, and suddenly the Nazca Desert reveals one of archaeology's most bewildering puzzles. Massive geoglyphs that transform an entire landscape into a canvas for messages we're still struggling to decode. The hummingbird stretches longer than a football field, its wings spread in eternal flight across the plateau. Nearby, a spider displays anatomical details visible only from above, while geometric trapezoids and perfectly straight lines extend toward the horizon with surveyor-like precision. It's as if an ancient civilization decided to leave calling cards for an audience that wouldn't exist for another 1500 years. Maria Reich, the German mathematician who devoted her life to mapping these enigmatic figures, called them the world's largest astronomy book. She spent decades crawling across the desert with measuring tape and surveying equipment, documenting over 800 straight lines, 300 geometric figures, and 70 animal and plant designs scattered across 200 square miles of the Nazca Plateau. The Nazca people created this vast outdoor gallery between 200 BCE and 700 CE, during the same centuries when Romans were building their empire and Chinese emperors were constructing the Great Wall. But while those civilizations left behind monuments to human power, the Nazca seemed more interested in dialogue with the cosmos itself. The preservation is miraculous, a consequence of the Atacama Desert's hyper-arid climate, where rainfall is measured in decades rather than seasons. The dark volcanic stones that litter the desert floor, when moved aside, reveal lighter sand beneath. The Nazca artists worked by subtraction, removing rocks to expose contrasting colors that would remain visible for millennia. But why create art that can only be fully appreciated from an altitude the Nazca could never achieve? The mystery deepened when researchers realized that many of the lines point toward astronomical event solstices, equinoxes, and the rising points of significant constellations. The Nazca had apparently turned their entire landscape into a ritual calendar, marking cosmic time on a geographic scale. Some scholars propose the lines served as walking meditation paths, ceremonial routes connecting sacred sites across the desert. Participants would follow the geoglyphs' contours in ritual processions, their movement tracing animal forms and geometric patterns that possessed meaning beyond their visual impact. The act of walking the lines became part of their spiritual purpose. Others suggest more practical functions. The Nazca civilization struggled with water scarcity in their desert environment, developing sophisticated underground aqueduct systems called puquios that channeled groundwater from the Andes. Perhaps the lines marked water sources, or served as large-scale maps indicating the locations of these precious underground streams. The irrigation hypothesis gains credibility when you consider the Nazca's remarkable engineering achievements. Their puquios, many still functioning today, represent some of the most advanced hydraulic technology in the pre-Columbian Americas. A culture capable of such sophisticated water management might well have used their desert landscape as both practical tool and sacred space. More recent archaeological work has revealed that the geoglyphs weren't created in isolation but were part of a broader ritual landscape that included ceremonial centers, buried offerings, and pilgrimage routes. Pottery fragments and textile scraps found along the lines suggest they were actively used for centuries, not simply created and abandoned. The animal figures themselves offer clues to their purpose. The hummingbird, associated with fertility and rebirth in Andean cultures. The spider, linked to water divination and weather prediction. The monkey, connected to agricultural cycles. Each figure seems carefully chosen for its symbolic significance rather than artistic whimsy. Perhaps most intriguingly, recent analysis suggests the lines weren't meant to be viewed from aircraft, but rather from nearby hills and elevated platforms. The Nazca may have built observation towers or ceremonial mounds that provided elevated viewing angles, allowing ritual participants to see the full scope of the geoglyphs they were helping to create and maintain. The discovery of the Nazca lines forced archaeologists to expand their definition of monumental architecture. Here was a civilization that treated landscape itself as building material, creating sacred spaces on a scale that dwarfed any temple or palace. They'd transformed geography into theology, written their beliefs across the earth in lines that would outlast any stone structure. In an age of climate change and environmental crisis, the Nazca's landscape-scale thinking feels remarkably contemporary. They saw their desert not as empty space to be conquered, but as a living canvas for expressing their relationship with cosmic forces. Their lines remind us that some messages are too large to fit on temple walls. Sometimes you have to write across the world itself. The Arctic Ocean keeps its secrets jealously, locked beneath shifting ice and brutal weather that has claimed countless ships and explorers throughout history. But in 2014, Parks Canada marine archaeologists achieved what seemed impossible. They found HMS Erebus, one of two Royal Navy vessels that vanished with Sir John Franklin's expedition in 1845, perfectly preserved in the cold, dark waters off King William Island. 2 years later, Terror emerged from the depths as well, completing one of maritime archaeology's greatest detective stories. The ships had been missing for 169 years, becoming the stuff of legend, their fate the subject of endless speculation, scholarly debate, and tragic ballads. Now they could finally tell their own story. Franklin's Northwest Passage expedition had departed England with supreme confidence, carrying 134 men aboard two of the Royal Navy's most advanced vessels. Erebus and Terror were bomb ships, built to withstand cannon fire, reinforced with iron plating, and equipped with steam engines, the latest in maritime technology. If any ships could force the legendary passage through Arctic ice, these were they. The Inuit knew better. Their oral histories, passed down through generations, told of ships trapped in ice, of desperate men walking south across the frozen wasteland, of a final camp where the last survivors had resorted to cannibalism before succumbing to cold and starvation. But Victorian England dismissed these accounts as primitive superstition, preferring theories of heroic disaster to uncomfortable truths about colonial hubris. The underwater discoveries revealed a more complex narrative. Erebus had been abandoned in excellent condition, its lower deck sealed and preserved by Arctic waters. The ship's contents painted a picture of orderly evacuation rather than panicked flight officers' cabins still contained personal effects. The galley held ceramic dishes stacked as if waiting for the next meal, and navigational instruments remained at their stations. Terror, found in deeper water and even better preserved, told a similar story of methodical abandonment. The ship had been carefully secured before evacuation, its hatches battened down and precious supplies organized for removal. These weren't vessels destroyed by crushing ice, but ships deliberately left behind by crews following what they believed was sound survival strategy. The artifacts emerging from both wrecks revolutionized understanding of the expedition's final years. Preserved organic materials, leather boots, woolen clothing, even food containers with identifiable contents provided intimate glimpses into daily life aboard ice-locked ships. The crews had survived at least 3 winters in the Arctic, far longer than previously believed. More significantly, the archaeological evidence validated generations of Inuit testimony that colonial authorities had dismissed. Native accounts of ship locations, crew behavior, and timeline proved remarkably accurate. The oral tradition had preserved historical facts, with a precision that European written records couldn't match, yet it had taken underwater archaeology to give those voices the credibility they deserved. The ships themselves became time capsules of Victorian maritime technology. Terra's engine, still mounted in its original position, represented cutting-edge steam propulsion adapted for polar conditions. The reinforced hulls showed evidence of ice damage, but also revealed how well 19th-century shipbuilders understood Arctic conditions. These vessels had been built for exactly the conditions that ultimately trapped them. Personal artifacts told human stories that expedition records couldn't capture. A officer's telescope, carefully wrapped and stored. A sailor's clay pipe, never to be smoked again. Children's toys brought by officers hoping to trade with native populations. Each object represented individual lives, personal hopes, and private fears frozen in Arctic time. The preservation extended to organic materials rarely found in archaeological contexts. Leather bindings on books remained supple enough to read. Fabric showed original colors and weaving patterns. Food containers still held identifiable remains of the expedition's provisions, providing insight into both Royal Navy nutrition and 19th-century food preservation technology. Perhaps most poignantly, the wrecks preserved evidence of the crew's final attempts at survival. Modified equipment suggested improvised solutions to unprecedented challenges. Stripped fittings indicated systematic salvage of useful materials. The ships had been methodically cannibalized by men who understood they were facing an impossible situation, but refused to surrender without exhausting every option. The Franklin expedition's discovery also highlighted climate change's impact on Arctic archaeology. The ships became accessible only because warming temperatures had reduced sea ice coverage, opening water that had been frozen solid for centuries. The same climate change that enabled their discovery now threatens to destroy other Arctic archaeological sites as permafrost melts and coastal erosion accelerates. Today, Erebus and Terra serve as both historical monuments and environmental warnings. They remind us that technological superiority means nothing against natural forces, that indigenous knowledge often surpasses colonial expertise, and that the Arctic's apparent emptiness conceals stories of human courage, folly, and resilience. The ships that once sought to conquer the Northwest Passage now rest as permanent reminders that the passage conquered them instead. 2,000 years after his death, China's first emperor still commands armies. His terracotta warriors stand in endless ranks beneath the lowest soil of Xi'an, but they're merely the honor guard for what may be archaeology's ultimate prize, the unopened tomb of Qin Shi Huang, China's most megalomaniacal ruler, and the man who unified a continent through sheer force of will. The tomb complex sprawls across 22 square miles, making the pyramids of Giza look like modest garden sheds. Ancient historians described it as an underground replica of the empire itself, complete with flowing rivers of mercury, mechanized crossbows set to fire at intruders, and a bronze dome studded with pearls to represent the celestial sphere. Modern science suggests these weren't poetic exaggerations but literal descriptions of the world's most elaborate burial chamber. Ground-penetrating radar reveals massive anomalies beneath the central mound-hollow spaces that could contain anything from treasure chambers to preserved organic materials. Soil samples show mercury concentrations hundreds of times above normal levels. Exactly what you'd expect if liquid mercury really had been used to create artificial rivers throughout the tomb complex. Chemical analysis has detected traces of ancient bronze, gold, and other metals that shouldn't exist in natural soil. Yet the tomb remains sealed, protected by a combination of imperial decree, engineering brilliance, and modern archaeological ethics. Chinese authorities have declared it off-limits for excavation, preferring to wait until technology advances enough to guarantee perfect preservation of whatever lies within. It's a decision that would have amused Qin Shi Huang, who spent his life obsessed with controlling the future. The first emperor's paranoia about death extended to fanatical preparations for the afterlife. He'd consumed mercury pills believing they would grant immortality, slowly poisoning himself while commissioning the most elaborate burial preparations in human history. The tomb project employed over 700 workers during its construction, roughly the same number of people who died building it, if ancient accounts are accurate. Sima Qian, the grand historian who documented the tomb's construction, wrote that artisans were sealed inside the burial chamber to prevent them from revealing its secrets. Concubines who had never borne the emperor children were buried alive to serve him in death. The tomb's designers were executed to ensure its location would remain secret. Even in death, Qin Shi Huang ruled through terror. But the emperor's greatest innovation may have been his approach to eternal security. Rather than relying solely on hidden location or physical barriers, he apparently booby-trapped the entire complex with mechanical devices powered by flowing mercury. Ancient texts describe crossbows that would automatically fire at intruders, triggered by pressure plates and counterweight systems that could theoretically function for millennia. Modern seismic surveys suggest these descriptions weren't fantasy. Unusual resonance patterns indicate hollow chambers connected by channels that could accommodate flowing liquid. The mercury rivers weren't merely decorative but functional, providing hydraulic power for mechanical systems throughout the tomb complex. The first emperor had essentially created the world's first automated security system. The ethical implications of excavation grow more complex with each new technological advance. X-ray imaging could potentially map the tomb's contents without physical intrusion. Chemical analysis might reveal preservation states of organic materials. Advanced robotics could explore chambers without human contamination. Yet each investigation raises questions about cultural respect, scholarly colonialism, and the right to disturb the dead. Chinese archaeology has evolved from treasure hunting to scientific preservation, but the emperor's tomb represents unique challenges. Any excavation would essentially be irreversible once opened. The tomb's sealed environment would be permanently altered. Organic materials preserved for 2 millennia could disintegrate within hours of exposure to outside air. The mercury rivers, if they still flow, could create environmental hazards that would complicate any exploration. Perhaps more intriguingly, ground-penetrating radar suggests the tomb contains materials that don't match any known archaeological patterns. Density readings indicate objects too large to be typical burial goods, too uniform to be natural formations. The emperor may have taken technologies, documents, or artifacts to his grave that could rewrite Chinese history or world history. Recent advances in non-invasive archaeology offer tantalizing possibilities. LiDAR mapping could reveal the tomb's internal structure without excavation. Chemical sensors could analyze air composition within sealed chambers. Micro-robots could potentially explore small spaces without disturbing larger areas. The technology to safely investigate the tomb may finally be approaching feasibility. Yet the tomb's greatest mystery may not be what it contains, but what it represents. Qin Shi Huang unified China through ruthless efficiency, standardizing everything from currency to writing systems. His tomb may be the ultimate expression of that systematic approach to power, a perfectly controlled environment where even death followed imperial regulations. The first emperor sought to rule forever, and in a sense, he has succeeded. His sealed tomb continues to command respect, inspire fear, and resist investigation 22 centuries after his death. Whether that represents ultimate victory or ultimate failure remains to be seen. Terry Herbert was just another weekend metal detectorist wandering the muddy fields of Staffordshire when his machine began screaming at him in 2009. 5 sweeps across the ploughed furrows yielded more Anglo-Saxon gold than most museums possess. By the time professional archaeologists finished their excavation, they'd recovered over 40 objects, weighing 11 pounds, the largest hoard of Anglo-Saxon treasure ever discovered. The Staffordshire hoard, as it came to be known, wasn't your typical buried treasure. This wasn't a merchant's emergency stash or a wealthy family's hidden savings. The hoard consisted almost entirely of military equipment. Sword pommels inlaid with garnet, helmet decorations worked in gold filigree, and weapon fittings that represented the absolute pinnacle of 7th century craftsmanship. What made the discovery truly extraordinary was its deliberate composition. Someone had carefully dismantled weapons and armor, removing every decorative element while discarding the functional iron beneath. Gold sword hilts were present, but not the blades. Helmet decorations survived, but not the protective shells. It was as if someone had systematically stripped the bling from an entire army's worth of equipment. The garnets alone revolutionized understanding of early medieval trade networks. Chemical analysis revealed that these semi-precious stones had traveled from India and Sri Lanka, crossing continents through Byzantine and Frankish trading routes before reaching Anglo-Saxon workshops. Each tiny red gem represented thousands of miles of dangerous travel through hostile territories. Yet they were common enough that Mercian craftsmen could afford to use them for purely decorative purposes. The goldwork itself displayed techniques that modern jewelers struggle to replicate. Filigree patterns finer than human hair were twisted into complex geometric designs. Cloisonné settings held hundreds of individually cut garnets in patterns so intricate they required magnification to fully appreciate. These weren't barbaric tribesmen working with primitive tools, but master craftsmen whose skills rivaled anything produced in contemporary Byzantium or Persia. Religious and military iconography intermingled throughout the hoard in ways that challenged assumptions about Anglo-Saxon Christianity. A gold strip inscribed with Latin biblical text, "Rise up, O Lord, and may thy enemies be scattered, and those who hate thee be driven from thy face," had been folded and treated like a military talisman. Christian symbolism appeared alongside warrior imagery, suggesting a culture where faith and warfare were intimately connected. The hoard's most enigmatic piece remains a ceremonial helmet cheek guard, decorated with interlaced animals and runic inscriptions. The artwork demonstrated influence from Scandinavian, Celtic, and Germanic traditions, while the craftsmanship quality suggested royal ownership. This wasn't peasant metalwork, but regalia fit for a king, possibly even Penda of Mercia, the last great pagan ruler of Anglo-Saxon England. Dating analysis placed the hoard's burial sometime between 650 and 675 CE, precisely the period when Mercia was expanding from regional kingdom to dominant Anglo-Saxon power. The timing suggests the treasure might represent spoils from specific historical battles, perhaps the aftermath of conflicts between Christian and pagan kingdoms that shaped early English identity. The geographic distribution of stylistic influences within the hoard mapped perfectly onto contemporary political alliances and trade relationships. Frankish techniques appeared alongside Scandinavian motifs and Byzantine design elements, creating a material culture that reflected Mercia's position at the center of European networks. The hoard served as a 7th century passport, documenting the kingdom's diplomatic and commercial connections. But perhaps the most significant revelation was what the hoard suggested about Anglo-Saxon society's complexity. Traditional narratives portrayed the period as a dark age of primitive warrior bands squabbling over territory. The Staffordshire treasure revealed instead a sophisticated economy capable of supporting specialized craftsmen, international trade networks, and cultural exchange that spanned continents. The hoard's burial circumstances remain mysterious. Why would anyone bury 11 pounds of processed gold and never return for it? The systematic dismantling suggests ritual rather than emergency concealment, perhaps a ceremonial offering or the remnants of funerary practices we don't fully understand. The treasure might have been too spiritually dangerous to possess, too politically sensitive to display, or too valuable to risk losing in warfare. Modern conservation techniques have revealed details invisible to the original archaeologists. X-ray imaging shows construction methods and repair patterns that illuminate medieval workshop practices. Chemical analysis identifies metal sources and alloy compositions that map prehistoric mining operations. Each object contains multiple layers of information about technology, trade, politics, and belief systems. The hoard forced complete reconsideration of Mercian power and influence during the 7th century. This wasn't a peripheral kingdom on the edges of European civilization, but a major player in international politics, capable of accumulating wealth that rivaled contemporary continental powers. The Anglo-Saxons had entered European history not as barbarian invaders, but as sophisticated political actors with their own distinctive material culture. Terry Herbert's weekend hobby had uncovered evidence of a hidden kingdom, one whose power and sophistication had been lost to historical record, but preserved in 11 pounds of buried gold.